once you got on the aircraft, we'd take off and they'd just radio to the F4 Phantom, it's all yours, and they would just come in and literally drop everything they had in one big hit. Unfortunately, on this particular case, I was allotted the job of coming out with a 2 KIA. That was my first experience of a medevac. But what you were looking at was 2 men on 2 stretchers that you probably could have put both of them onto one stretcher. Was a very quick, rude awakening. We thought we were going to crash from 2,500 feet. I looked up at the radar and thought we were going to lose the radar, and I looked across at the crewman, he looked at me, and we both thought the same thing. And I said, well, I'll see you on the other side. He said, you laid down the gun, but you picked up the sword, and you will fight the bureaucratic system as long as you have breath, won't you? And I said, I don't know, probably. Okay, well, I was born in the United Kingdom. I was born in a place called Bagshot, Surrey, and my parents were both ex-service people. Migrated to Australia when I was approximately 2-year-old, and I think they settled in Taree around Newcastle.
Where did your interest in joining the military start?
I really can't answer. I think that probably because I was looking for a future, I suppose. You know, I thought, well, excuse the expression, I can't be a bum all my life, particularly what I was. I mean, I didn't have any, though I'd spent so much time with my father learning the trade, and probably in all honesty, I could have actually did a full apprenticeship with my father, you know, and been a registered builder in those days. But I think I got to the point where I thought, well, you know, I've got to do something with my life, and the military, you know, those days was an option of a career and maybe see the world and travel and all those sort of things. So I just sort of think, I think probably the other thing is because I said, when I was 17 with one of my mates, I joined the CMF and I was in the artillery unit, and I enjoyed that. You know, it was outdoors and got out and got into the bush. We went camping and, you know, dragged big guns around and all this sort of thing. I suppose in a way it was like playing cowboys and Indians in one sense, but it was good. It was enjoyable. You mixed with people and you had a good time. So I enjoyed that life. So with the things coming on with the service, it probably turned around and said, well, okay, it's a nice life. There's probably a good future in this, you know. So I did. I actually then went and applied to join the army, and it's terrible to say, but I failed the entry exam. And I think I was only just probably 17 and a half, just over 17. And I think probably I educated myself more when I got out of the service than I was school than when I was in school. I was always terrified of exams and all this sort of thing, and I remember doing the army exam, and I don't think I could have told you what 2 and 2 was. I just had a complete mental drain, block. As I said, 1 and 1 would have made 100 to me. So unfortunately, I failed the exam, and even the examiner said, you know, obviously your mind's just switched off. And I said, it was. I said, and that's. So he said, well, you can always apply again later on. So anyway, I was a bit disheartened, things like that. So I went away, and probably about 8 or 9 months later, I was walking past the recruitment centre, and there was a poster, Air Force poster up, and it was to do with guard dogs and things like this. And I thought, oh, I like animals, maybe, you know, I'll look into this. So I went in and made inquiries about it, you know, and got the papers. And I took them home and read the brochures and stuff like that. Thought, yeah, that would be quite a good life, you know. I have an interest in dogs and things like this. A good future, reasonable pay, I suppose, for one of them. So I filled the forms out, and I gave them to my father to sign them because I was under the age of 21. And my father then gave them to my mother to sign. And unbeknown to them, I overheard something my mother was saying to my father, and it was the fact that she didn't want to sign my application or give consent for me to join the Air Force because Vietnam was starting, and she was very worried that possibly I could be sent to Vietnam. And my father turned around to my mother and said they weren't aware that I actually heard them. But my father said to my mother, look, don't worry, just sign it, because he couldn't pass the Army entry exam. The Air Force is a hell of a lot harder. He'll never pass the Air Force exam. Well, that was the biggest mistake my father ever made, because I was more determined that whatever I did, I would pass that exam. So they did sign it. And of course, obviously, I passed the exam. I didn't go into dog handling. I got conned into another branch of the service, but I never regretted that. So, but that's basically how I ended up in the service. My interest in West Australia at that time was canoeing, outdooring. I liked the outdoors. Did not like discos in any shape or form. I loved being outdoors. Beach, surfing, whitewater canoeing, because in those days, it's not like it is today, it was a new sport. We used to even make our own kayaks. Yeah. Go canoeing in the middle of winter. The water would be ice cold, freezing. We used to have one stretch of this river that we used to canoe, and we'd always end up getting tipped out of the canoe because we were a novice and we were learning. And anyway, we used to have massive fire on the bank, probably a flame 6 or 7 foot high. And we'd stand there, freezing cold until we got roasted on one side, turned around, got dried on the other side, then grab our canoe and then charge back up 300 or 400 yards or maybe further back up the river, jump in again, come on down over all the rapids, end up in the water again, do the same. And we'd do that all day and enjoy every minute of it. And yet, strangely enough, the whole time I did that, I never ever had a cold or a flu. Never got sick. So the people say, you do these sort of things, you'll get cold, you'll get sick. And no, I never got sick. I really had a good time. Yeah, it was good.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you did during rookies training? What sort of training exercises?
You did things like, obviously whipping. They had a obstacle course. You learnt about military law, about law and charges and all that sort of stuff. A little bit about chemical warfare, all that thing. Drill, of course, obviously, was a big factor. Drill and discipline. When I did camps, I think we did a couple of camps. PT, physical fitness, all those types of things. And you used to have an exam, I think, every week. And it was a multiple choice type exams. You didn't have to write paragraphs upon it. You didn't have to give your interpretations. The exams were pretty, in a sense, it's probably not a right way to say it, but pretty simple in the sense that it was a multiple choice of questions. Obviously there was four answers. One was the right answer, one was very, very close to the right answer, and you had the other two that one would be absolutely ridiculous and the other one was wrong. You still had to know the subject that you were dealing with, because you had one that was very close, and it was a case you ticked a box when you read the question, and yep, okay, that's the answer to that question. Now, the question could be a very long question. It could go, quarter of a page or something. But you had to know what that instructional course was.
So can you tell us about going to Amberley and what happened there?
Yeah, well, we were sent from Canberra to Amberley by train. We put on a train and sent up there. I think it took a couple of days. Stopped off in Sydney. Actually chatted up a couple of girls on the train too. One was from Townsville. And I saw her once or twice after I got to Amberley. But then, of course, I didn't have a car. So in those days you needed a car to win onto the girls. So at that time I didn't have a car because obviously when I joined, I couldn't bring my car with me, and I left it with my parents, and they were using it to travel around, so I didn't have a car, so everything was, Shanks's pony. But I said, music-wise, it was just the same as even today, the young people. Whatever was in fashion at that time. I certainly don't have the same interest in music today.
So you went on the train up to Abilene, and what happened when you arrived in Abilene?
Oh, we were picked up at the station by a RAF vehicle, and obviously taken out to Amberley, and then you do your normal reporting. You have to go to the barracks. You get issued with bedding and allotted a barracks and stuff like that. And
so can you tell us about the course? What kinds of things you were doing, and what was your typical sort of routine? And
well, then of course it was a Defence Guard course, so it was basically infantry type thing. That was we used to argue quite often. We didn't argue, but we used to ask questions, and the DI's favourite answer was, oh, this is the Air Force, not the Army, but they were actually training us on Army sort of guidelines, so in weaponries and chemical warfare and all these things. So occasionally we'd ask a question, and they say, oh yeah, but you're Air Force, not Army, so that doesn't apply. Well, because at that point in stage, the Defence Guard was only, in a sense, though it does date back to the Second World War, we'd only been revived. I mean, I was on number 5 course, so that shows you how many courses had gone through. And so you did the things like chemical warfare, drill, weaponry, parades, guards, all that type of stuff.
what sort of weaponry were you dealing with?
The SLR, Belgian rifle, SLR single rifle, 7.62. At that time we still had a few Owens in the Second World War era. The F1 submachine gun was coming in, the 9mm pistol and the M60s, and that was it. That was the thing. And of course we did radio procedure and all that type of stuff.
So what were your thoughts about being posted to Vietnam at that time?
I suppose it wasn't so, I suppose, excitement. I think, well, I don't, there was no ill feeling to it. I suppose there was a certain amount of excitement. You're young, you're 19, you're invincible. Nobody can destroy you. You're young, you're fit, you've just finished training. I don't think, reality hasn't hit you. I thought, being posted to Vietnam. Oh, great, going overseas. I'm going on a holiday. I made jokes about it to people. They asked me, I said, what do you think about being posted to Vietnam? And I said, well, the government lied to me. And I said, what do you mean? I said, well, they told me I was going overseas on a holiday. They were going to pay for all my airfares, all my accommodation, all my food, and I would have cheap alcohol, and I could chase all the girls I wanted. I said, the only part they didn't tell me, I said, was somebody might try and shoot me. And I thought that was very unfriendly. So, but, when I look back at it, no, there was no apprehension or, oh, geez, I wish I hadn't done this, or, no. I think we were all excited. I think same as the Second World War guys, when they went off to war. When you see them waving and cheering and things like that, they thought you were going to get injured. You're invincible. It's not going to happen to you. It'll happen to somebody else. And you're going to be stationed in Vung Tau, and what's going to happen there? Different for the Army guys who were infantry, so there was no upset. And of course then we got 7 days pre-em leave. Everybody was sent home. They paid all their airfare. I actually got 9 days because I had to fly to Carnarvon in West Australia, so I got extra 2 days for travelling. And I notified my mother that I was coming home. She asked how come. She said, you're not going AWOL again, eh? I said, no, I'm not going AWOL. I said, I've just finished my training, and before we get our postings, rather than sit around here because we've got some leave due, I want to come home, because my parents were travelling up to Darwin and across. So I said, I might get a chance to see you until you finally get back to Queensland. I said, and you never know. I said, I might get posted back to Pierce. So I said, I don't know things. So I said, no, I'll come home. We don't want to sit around here. So, but of course she wasn't aware that I was going to Vietnam. And I flew to Perth and then caught a plane to Carnarvon. And my mother met me, of course, and my brothers, because my brothers were only pretty young then. I was about, 11 and 9, I think one was. And so went fishing and had a holiday. And my mother kept asking me, did I know where I was being posted to? And I kept lying, because I already knew where I was going. And they, of course, were living in a caravan. And the night before I was due to go home is the actual time that I told them where I was being posted to. Because I still remember I said to Mum and Dad, I need to talk to you. Would you please sit down? And my mother actually tweaked there and then what I was about to say. Because I virtually started to talk and she says, you're not going to tell me you've been posted to Vietnam, are you? And I said, unfortunately, Mother, I am telling you that. And I am going to Vietnam in about a week's time. I said, I'll be leaving for Vietnam on the 5th of June, or arriving in Vietnam on the 5th of June. And of course, my mother then proceeded to say, Deb, don't volunteer for anything. You remember, never volunteer. And she went on and asked me why I hadn't told her when I arrived and everything else. And I told her, and I said, well, I want to enjoy the holiday, and I didn't really want to put any sort of gloom. I said, I don't foresee myself being in any great danger, but I said, I didn't want to spend the week here with you thinking all the time, you know, maybe or maybe not, something might happen to me. So I said, I just want to enjoy the holiday. And of course, I jumped on the plane the next morning, flew back to Amberley. I think I spent another week, maybe a bit longer there. And then we were flown to Sydney, and we stayed at Bankstown. The airport there, they had some RAF barracks there, and that's where we were actually stayed the night. We all decided we'd go into town and kick up our heels, being it was our last time in Australia. We did, and regrettably, we were refused entry into an RSL. And I will swear that on a Bible in front of anybody. And we were actually refused. We had our military IDs and everything with us, but the RSL in Bankstown refused to allow us to come in, even when we told them we were being posted to Vietnam. They refused. I did not find out till later in life that actually we could have taken the RSL to task on that, but they actually refused us. So, excuse the expression, we cracked the shits and went back to Bankstown, and we got drunk at their little bar, you know. And then the next morning, in civilian clothes, not in military clothes, we were taken to the airport. We boarded a commercial flight, Qantas, in a 707, I think it was, and we were flown to Manila, and we were met at the airport by, I think, staff from the Australian Embassy. We were taken to a hotel, which I still remember the name of. It's called the Timber Lodge. And on that plane, I suppose, which is a rather interesting thing, one of the young guys decided and he would drink every one of the drinks that were on the drink menu, starting at the top and working his way through it. Being young and stupid as we were, he succeeded to do that. To what extent he got, but we do know that we all looked around when we landed at the airport, and anybody who's been overseas will know that it gets bloody hot. And you saw the heat coming off the tarmac as we looked out the window, and then we all looked around at him and went, he's not going to make it. At that time, you didn't come up like you do today to a big tunnel and walk into the airport. You actually got off the plane, walked down steps across the tarmac. So we all decided to take bets on how long it would take him to pass out, because he was all right in the air-conditioned thing, but as soon as he got outside. So being all great guys we are, we decided to let him go first. So he gets to the top of the stairs off the aircraft and he collapses and he falls all the way down to the bottom. And of course, we all laugh. We think it's a great joke. Doesn't even hurt himself. Two of the guys go down, and I still can picture it. One on each side of him, arm around their neck, and carrying him across the tarmac through the airport into the thing. And he was actually it was a VW combi. They had about 3 or 4 combis there. And he is out to it. And everybody's saying, we're in this combi, there's about 7 of them, it's jam-packed. Everybody's saying, don't you dare be sick in this bus. Whatever you do, if you want to be sick, you sing out. So anyway, we get to this motel, and just as we get into the door, he says, I want to be sick. You've never seen about 8 guys trying to get out of one door at the same time. And he is sick. He's very sick. So anyway, a couple of guys race in, because it's already pre-booked. We have one complete floor. They grab the keys to his room, or one of the rooms. They take him upstairs and they throw him full bodily into the shower and turn the cold water on. And they left him there for about an hour. He does not remember a thing of the next 24 hours. I won't go into what went on in the next 24 hours because it was an education. We got out and around the town and we chased girls and we did all the young wild things. But I do remember about 8 of us went out. And when we walked downstairs, the security guard, and this is a time, of Marcos era and guns and around the street. And the security guard said to us, look, you stay together and, because we're only 19-year-old. We're not used to violence, He said, don't go anywhere by yourselves. Stay together and stay where there's plenty of light, It can be dangerous. So we're walking down the street and we walk past a cinema. And there's a big sign up there. All firearms and pistols to be checked into the thing. And we're going, like, hey, are they joking? And they do. And you see guys walking up there with pistols. And they're checking them in like you're checking in a hat or a coat. I thought, oh, okay. And then we walk past this alleyway, and next thing a guy comes out of there, a Filipino, and he's covered in blood. I don't know what had happened to him, but we didn't hang around to find out because there was a lot of rackets and everything else. So we just thought, hang on, this is a bit wild and woolly for us. So we all hightailed it back to the hotel, and we'll drink in the bar. We don't need all this fun. So that's what we did. So it was suddenly starting to wake up that, hey, it's a different world out there. It's not like in Australia where, walk around and things like that. Suddenly people are carrying guns and knives and people are getting hurt, And we're thinking, I remember the discussion was basically, well, geez, this is what it's like here. What's Vietnam going to be like?
Before you arrived in Vietnam, what were you briefed about what to expect there?
I don't think, trying to cast my mind, I don't think really much. Really, I don't. Because I don't think any of our training staff had been there. But nobody, there was one guy in my course, which I'm friends with still, he'd been in U-Bond as a general hand and come back, right? At that time, U-Bond in Thailand, there was fighters going into Vietnam from the American forces. But I don't really remember any talk about it. I think the Sergeant Thorley, he was an ex-Korean veteran, and I think he talked a bit about Korea and stuff like that, but I don't think any of our training staff at that point in time had seen any form of overseas service at all. So, from what I can remember, I don't remember being briefed in a great deal about what to expect. And probably the reflection being that the fact that when we arrived in Saigon, when we were taken off this aircraft with our luggage and sat at the area that we were allotted to on our bags, waiting for 35 Squadron Caribou to come up to pick us up, we suddenly start seeing people with jeeps, M60 machine guns and flak jackets and helmets and driving around and guys walking around with weapons and we're sitting on a tarmac in civilian clothes with nothing. And and you're seeing these fighters constantly taking off and gunships and all this, you're starting to say, well, hang on a minute, this is getting a little bit serious now, and then suddenly for a caribou to come in and you all load all your gear on and then off down to Vung Tau and you're suddenly flying over the top and you can see, artillery landing down below and, explosions, and you suddenly, your thought comes to your mind that you haven't even got a weapon with you. So you suddenly, oh, hang on a minute. You're looking down, you're looking all over the monsoon and mangroves and all that, the delta area. And holy mackerel, this is getting serious.
How well prepared did you think you were?
As far as my training? Oh, I thought I was more than adequately trained. I thought I was able to do whatever was required of me. I think the biggest thought in your mind is, were you able to carry out what was required of you? What your duty was going to be. That you wouldn't falter or let your mates down. That's probably the most important thing to you, is that your mates, you would not let your mates down if their situation ever arose. So, and I think we all had probably the same sort of concept suddenly,
Did you have any training in aircraft in Ambling? Did you?
No,
not at all.
Not at all. When I was at Ambling, it was only Canberra bombers, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, and Hercs and things like that would fly, and I think we even still had the old C-47s, the old Dakotas, couple up there. So I had no training on aircraft. In fact, I never even would have thought in my wildest dreams that I was going to end up becoming aircrew. We'd never even thought that. So,
So can you describe that scene a little bit more in Saigon at the airport, the sort of everything that was happening and what you saw?
Oh, well, you saw like phantoms, fighters, fully laden with bombs, taxiing out to runways, and constantly aircraft, one after the other, taking off, and no sooner one aircraft is taking off. I mean, at that time, Saigon was probably the busiest airport in the world. I mean, literally they were lined up like taxis, and you would see everything from cargo planes to, civilian aircraft like 707s, like Pan Am. You would see everything, every conceivable type of plane you would see, lined up like a taxi, waiting to go onto the runway to take off, and you would see them virtually one take off, and as you would see another one coming in on approach, and you'd say, if anybody gets out of rhythm here, something's going to be an awful big accident, because virtually there'll be an aircraft halfway down the runway when one is landing, and by the time that one's down the end of the runway and about to taxi off, there's another one already coming down the runway to take off. So it's a constant down, up, down. And I said, you'd look at it and think, if they ever get out of rhythm, they're going to be one hell of a backup. Because I said, there was everything from fighters, and you're talking about aircraft loaded with, massive armament, 500-pound bombs and things like that. So, I mean, a horrific thing, big cargo planes taking off. So, and you look around and you see all these revetments, these big revetments where aircraft are parked, and guards all walking around, fully armed with flak jackets and helmets on. It really starts to home into you that, like, this is some very serious things going to be going on, and so.
So can you tell us about that journey to Vung Tau?
Yeah, I can't remember how long that was. It was in a caribou, very noisy. We're all trying to stick it out. The wind is to have a look. But I do remember looking down thinking, and I don't know if other guys were thinking, oh, hell, what happens if this aircraft was, forced down something, something happened and, you didn't even have any weapon, and here you are in civilian clothes and all your uniforms in the thing. So I think, but it wasn't a very long flight, so, you landed and all your gear was taken.
So when you arrived at Vung Tau, what was the scene like there?
Oh, I said, trying to look back at that. And obviously, we landed at Vung Tau and threw all our gear off the plane and got loaded onto trucks. And when I originally arrived there, the RAF didn't have their own contingent. When I arrived there, the RAF, I think it was 5 ACS Squadron, was still building our barrack area, our contingent area as they called it. So at that point in time, the airmen were split up in different areas. We had some American barracks, I think 3 or 4 barracks that airmen, and I think maybe some of the NCOs were involved in. And then they had 3 villas in Vung Tau. One was right on the beach, and that was an old French villa, going back to French days. And that had the catering section in it. And then around the corner from that was another French villa, and that was officers' quarters. And then downtown, which was another one which I hated something ferociously, was down a little alleyway, and it was another officers' quarters. So they were actually billeted in town, and we had to guard those areas. But the airmen and that, you were on the same with the officers, you would come to this villa at the beach in trucks. There'd be so many, whatever time stand hours, a certain time, trucks would start going to Vung Tau to the mess, and you would go in and have your meal at this mess, and then jump on a truck and go back to wherever your barracks were. So most guys would sort of knock off work, for want of a better word, get in the boozer, have a few cans of beer, and everybody would try and catch the last truck to go and have dinner. And of course, then we used to do some wild things in town.
When you first arrived at Vung Tau, what sort of activity was going on at the airport there? The aerodrome, I should say.
Well, that was, like 35 Squadron was stationed there, and they had American aircraft and that. Sort of resupply and stuff like that.
How busy was it compared with Saigon, for example? I mean,
still fairly busy. I mean, you had, because obviously there's a lot more helicopters and that there and that.
Can you describe that scene for us, exactly when you landed, if you like, what you saw?
Well, their runway was actually made of that metal like you see in the Second World War, with that interwest steel. You just looked around, you saw aircraft and barbed wire and bits and pieces of different things, Strange enough, I can't actually remember a great deal of that part of the airstrip. So basically you were pretty well quickly thrown off the thing and into a truck and taken away and given a briefing on, where you are and what's this and where you're not to go and what to expect and all this sort of thing. And then you were put on a truck and taken through town and given you an outlay and where you were allowed to go and where you weren't allowed to go, and that was a street of bars and all these sort of different things. And as I said, be made aware of the black market, and that if you were caught in the black market you would be charged. And you certainly weren't expected to take any foreign currency into town. And that's,
What did they tell you about the black market?
Oh, black market, Well, in the black market, of course, they would dearly love to get US dollars because it was worth a fortune. I mean, you could almost ask anything. You would be constantly asked by the Vietnamese, do you have any dollars? Be quite regularly asked. Selling alcohol, because we could buy a bottle of whiskey for a few dollars, and it would bring 3 or 4 times that much back down to town. So, and soap, all sorts of silly things. I mean, nothing, we're not talking about weapons or anything like that. We're just talking about general Western things.
So on that first briefing, when you first arrived, you were briefed. Do you remember what they told you about what you were going to be doing and so forth? Oh
yeah, my role was going to be defence, which meant perimeter and security and guards and escort of the officers and stuff like that. Night time we used to have to escort, armed escort the officers or things into town or things like that. So that was going to be our job when I first got there. you know, guard the perimeter. Because then, as I said, originally then, we used to have to guard all these French villas. That was our primary role, and we had to guard them.
Can you sort of take us, if you like, on that truck ride through Vung Tau and describe what it was like, what sort of place it was?
Pretty primitive. You know, I mean, like thatch huts and huts made with beer cans, like, you know, Coke cans and all sorts of things.
Huts made with beer cans?
Yeah, they used to use anything. Yeah,
How did they do that?
just flatten them out, open them up, tack them on. Yeah. I think I've got slides of it somewhere there, different things, yeah. Bits of tin, they'd scrounge anything. They'd do anything.
Sorry, so we're nearly finished, sorry.
Yeah.
They used to use anything?
Anything. Yeah, they could scrounge. You know, anything they could scrounge they would use. So, you know, so it's all different things. But, you know, the town, you know, it had little towns had different things there. You know, it probably went back to the French stage. They had the shops and that. One thing about it, if you got lost in Vung Tau and you walked past a butcher shop, you sure as hell smelt it. I still remember that. I mean, there was no refrigeration. They used to just hang it up outside. And flies, I think I've even got a photo of it somewhere.
Can you tell us a little bit about the camp at Vung Tau?
Well, the camp, when I said originally when I first went there, we were in American barracks because I think it was 5 ACS Squadron was building our contingent, which was just inside the main gate of Vung Tau. That would have probably been about only for a month when I was there, maybe a bit longer. And then all the RAF personnel were then transferred to that barracks or contingent area. And that consisted of 2-story barracks, wooden barracks, and just as I said, it was barracks, bunks on each side and everything else. No windows, but fly screened or mosquito screens on the sides. Halfway up was timber, then the rest was just screens. You had a mess, a wet canteen, and a cinema area. We had shower blocks with all the mod cons, you know, proper septic toilets and all that sort of stuff. Well built, actually. The squadron did a very good job. The sergeants had their own mess, the officers had theirs, they had their officers' quarters, senior NCO's quarters. Basically, like base squadron had its own sort of barrack area that it was in. 9 Squadron, which I became part of, had its own area, and I think that was their crew area. I think 35 may have even been in the same area, I'm not sure. And of course the sergeants and that whole of their own quarters, which were sort of a little bit apart from us. We had hut girls, which the Army didn't have. When I first went there, I think we paid them maybe 100, 200 pesos, which wasn't very much, probably the equivalent of about $10. I think it was a month, something like that. I can't remember exactly what time. And their role was to clean our barracks and wash our clothes. And at that time, even polish our boots. We were spoilt. A short time after that, the senior NCOs and that, or it was stopped, but the airmen had to polish their own boots. The officer got their boots polished, we didn't. And you had to supply, I think it was 200 pesos and 2 boxes of soap, which they never used. They took that down and sold it on the black market. They used their own soap, which wasn't like homemade type soap, wasn't really good. You learned very quickly, you washed your own underwear, because if they used that soap, they never washed it out properly. So if you would end up getting rashes and all sorts of things, so you washed all your own underwear, that they wash your uniforms. And basically, yeah, the mess was there, modern mess, all stainless steel. They had the best of every equipment. So it was certainly, as the Air Force was, we were far better off than the Army was with their field kitchens and that type of stuff. I wouldn't say that they were better cooks though. I hope no ex-cooks ever hears this, but no.
What were the RAF doing in Vietnam at that time?
Well, 9 Squadron was supporting the Army in their role. 35 seemed to have a mixed role actually. They seemed, I think, were mainly supporting the Australian training team, but I couldn't be sure on that because I had very little to do with 35. But they used to fly up to a lot of the American bases. So whether they actually were in support of them or just generally there, I'm not sure, you know. But quite often come home with bullet holes in their aircraft. And base squadron was, of course, they were the support unit for both squadrons. You know. You worked a 6-day week. When I was there, as I went there as a defence guard, you worked 6 days and had Sunday off. And that was your normal routine. You know, I can't remember what time we started, except like if you were, as a defence guard, you were on a roster system, you know, and you were rostered on shifts, whatever. I can't remember whether they were 8 or 12-hour shifts. I think it was 8-hour shifts, and whatever you were required to do. To a certain degree, it was boring, except when you get charged for being absent from place of duty, which I did one time. That was a rather interesting event.
What happened? Tell us about it.
Well, when I first got there, within the first probably month, it was a sort of a mixed up system.
Hang on a second, I'm going to interrupt you there.
Yeah, so what we were saying about the...
oh yes, start again with that story.
Charge. What actually happened, as I said, in that first period of time, it's a bit of a mixed up system. And I had looked at the roster and said, oh yeah, I'm on such and such, you know, might be afternoon shift or whatever it was. Anyway, I was actually sitting in the mess, about to eat a nice big steak. That part I still remember, because we didn't see it all that often. And one of the mates came up and said, what are you doing here? I said, what do you bloody well think I'm doing? I'm eating, of course. He said, but you're on guard duty at such and such a time. I said, bloody bull dust. I'm not on till such and such. He said, no, you're on. I looked at the board. He said, you're on it. And I thought he was having a go at me. I said, now listen here. If I pass up this bloody steak and I find out you're pulling my leg, you better watch out when I find you. I said, I'll give you what for? No, he said, you're on. You're on roster. So anyway, there was a truck going back to the barracks. I said, this was before the contingent was on thing. So sure enough, I get back there and I go and look at the roster and he's right. In about 30 minutes, I'm supposed to be on duty. You know, and to be charged on active service is not good on your record. So I quickly throw on all my gear. I miss the truck that goes back into town. So I physically ran. And just as well I was bloody well fit, I literally ran back into town. And people must have looked at this strange guy in, you know, jungle greens running. And I ran all the way to where I was supposed to be on duty. And what I was about 10 minutes late. 5 to 10 minutes. And the guy that was there, he was told, because I hadn't turned up to report for guard duty, that he'd have to stay there until they got a replacement. So I just said, well, look, just go and tell the sergeant, you know, what happened and it'll be fine. So I didn't think much of it. And the next day, I'm being told I'm going to be charged from being placed, you know, while on active service, absent from place of duty. And I went, oh, bullshit. That's rubbish. And it wasn't rubbish. This bloody sergeant, and he decided he would charge me. So he did. And anyway, I had to report to that time was a flight sergeant, he was acting WOD, to receive my charge. And when I read the charge, I just looked at him and laughed and said, what a lot of bullshit. Absolute bullshit. I said, it's rubbish. I said, I won't accept it. And of course he got crook at me. He had a real gravelly voice. He was a real old, probably going back to the Korean, probably, you know, era. You know, he'd been in there a long time. And he said, You will accept the charge. Rah, 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 rah. I said, okay, that's fine, accept the charge. And after I accepted, he said, now, you remember your military law? And I said, I think so. Read the charge again and read it carefully. So I did. And then, of course, the military law came back into my mind, and I started laughing. And he said, have you read it carefully? I said, yep. And he said, do you remember your law? I said, yep. And he said, well, what do you think's wrong with that charge? I said, he's wrong. He has said I was 10 or 20 minutes late for guard duty. Well, under military law at that time, you had to be very precise in your wording of a charge. Right? It had to be correct. And what he should have written was approximately 10 minutes late for guard duty. He stated a fact, I was. And all I had to prove, I didn't have to prove that I was not late for guard duty. All I had to prove that his statement on that charge was wrong. So I burst out laughing. And it turned out this flight sergeant didn't like this sergeant anyway. So I'm fronted up to the CO on this charge, and I marched in, cap off, and all the normal procedure in front of the CO. And you have to address the CO. The witnesses come in against you and all this, and you can ask questions, but you must ask through the CO, right? And then he will say to whoever it is. So I listened to the charges, the witnesses. He had the guy that I relieved. Yep. And then when the sergeant was marched in and gave his evidence, and then the CO asked me, did I have any questions? And I said, yes, I have one question. At what time did he visit my post to be accurate with 20 minutes late for guard duty? The CO, I could see his face turn bright red. He looked up at this sergeant and said, you've heard this airman's question. What time did you visit the guard post? And this sergeant had to say he didn't. And he said, I didn't. And he said, then how do you know he was 20 minutes late for guard duty? Oh, because when the other airman reported back, I looked at my watch. And he said, that is all, Sergeant. And as he was being marched out by the acting WOD, he said to the WOD, I will see that sergeant back in my office after this hearing. He marched out. The CO looked at me and said, charge dismissed. The warrant officer said, put cap on, salute, blah, 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 and marched out. As I marched out, I saw this sergeant, and he looked at me, and I just smiled at him, and I had to stay there for something. Anyway, he marched this sergeant back in, and the walls in the office weren't from floor to ceiling, so there was a gap, and he absolutely tore strips off this sergeant. And after he finished, he marched out, and this sergeant looked straight at me, and if looks could kill, I was a dead man. And that sergeant did try to square up with me, then later on. So that's how that came about. So it was an experience, and I beat it, again, because we went back to training. But then later on, when I applied for 9 Squadron, when they called for volunteers, we had to go for interviews. And when we went for the interviews, unbeknown to me, I was selected out of the group. All the names came up on a board. And I'd actually gone up, for some reason, to 9 Squadron or something. I can't remember. Actually, I think it was a friend of mine. I saw the list on the board, and I went, I didn't get on, because my name wasn't on this board in that section. So one of my mates, he'd been up to the squadron, and he'd seen the list. And he said to me, no, you were on the list. I said, no, I'm not. He said, yes, you are. He said, I've seen the one inside 9 Squadron headquarters, and you are one of the guys chosen. am I? So, being the person I am, I quickly went up to the 9 Squadron headquarters and said, I applied to become a volunteer for one of the crewmen gunners, and I'm not sure if someone's having a go at me, but I've been told I'm on the list and to be accepted. And the clerk said to me, what's your name? Blah, blah, blah. I gave him the details. He looked at the list and says, yep, you're on the list. Oh, that's interesting. So I politely turned around, marched back to our headquarters, sectional headquarters, walked in, looked at the board again, and this particular sergeant was sitting over there to the side. I went, what's it? Gee, that's funny. My name's not on the list. I didn't get accepted. And I heard the sergeant, so he said, oh, well, if you didn't get accepted, you didn't get accepted, did you? I said, that's very funny. I said, my name's on the list up at 9 Squadron, but it's not on this one. And he looked at me. Oh, I said, I better have a check-up on this. I said, yeah, I think I better go up to 9 Squadron again. He said, give me a few minutes and I'll double-check this. So I came back and I said there was a typing error. And I thought, you rotten so-and-so. Because what had happened, being it was a voluntary thing, if I hadn't fronted up on the date that I was supposed to, it would have been considered that I had no longer wanted to go with aircrew. So I wouldn't have been on. So he tried to square up with me the second time. He failed the second time. Not being out.
Did he ever get you?
No, because I went over to 9 Squadron then and he had no authority over me at all then because he was base squadron and then I was transferred to 9 Squadron. So I automatically went out of his jurisdiction. But he always used to give me a nice little smile as I used to give him a nice little smile.
Why did you want to go to 9 Squadron?
I think, well, I said, being that I'd flown over, I enjoyed flying and I suppose it was a sense of adventure. They called for volunteers from our unit because we were the first defence guards to go on Iroquois. I don't know, it appealed to me, you know, the fact of flying. And I suppose I was a little bit bored with guarding the fence, you know. Not that I wanted to sort of see any action, but I think I was just getting bored sitting 8 hours on a guard post and all those sort of things. So it was pretty mundane. So I just saw it and, okay, I'll plot in for it.
What was, going back to the guard position, what were the things that you were supposed to be looking out for?
Possible saboteurs, people VC trying to get in, but really in Vung Tau it was pretty well unlikely that was going to take place. And I'm unaware, it may have or may not have. I know Vung Tau was mortared and rocketed a few times, but I don't know of any infiltration attempted to come in through the wire. But, you know, guard and security of, you know, personnel, like you might do escort work, you know, officers or something might have to go into Vung Tau. They might feel uncomfortable by themselves or something like that, so they'd request an escort, so you'd go with them. There might be something, the duty officer or something might be required to go into Vung Tau at night time for some particular reason and he doesn't feel comfortable, then they would request an escort.
What had you heard about the VC at that point?
Well, they were just civilians who were communist people. I don't necessarily agree with their philosophy or them as an individual, but Vung Tau was basically at that time known as the VC R&R Centre. It was more than likely when you were in Vung Tau in some of the bars that some of the guys that were drinking, Vietnamese that were drinking, there were a very good chance that they were VC. In fact, some of even probably the bar girls were VC. Because one thing you never did if they started asking you questions about what you did, you never spoke about what your position was. And if my memory serves me correct, and actually the bus driver that we had was revealed to be a VC by captured documents. But he was gone before, he must have got the message by their bush telegram, and he was gone. But he was driving the bus back and forth, listening to the guys talking. So VC, Vung Tau was sort of known as a VC R&R centre. So probably to a certain degree they didn't cause too much ruckus there. you know, there was things that happened in Vung Tau, like there was Americans who got killed and stuff like that. You were probably, to a certain degree, more engagement from a group they used to call the Cowboys. We used to call them the Cowboys. They were young Vietnamese gangs, teenagers. And they used to ride like Lambrettas and wear tight cowboy hats. And they used to be in big groups, 15, 20. And if you saw them in town, where as possible, you were avoided, especially if you're not armed, you would avoid them. Because they felt pretty strong and brave when there was a big group of them. So you would avoid them where possible.
What would they do? What were they known to do?
Oh, they would beat them, beat guys up and stab them. There was Americans stabbed there. There was a couple of Americans who thought they were pretty robust type people that could take them on, and they tried to, and they got stabbed. So that's the fact. They'd stab and then they'd bolt. They wouldn't hang around. They'd stab them in the back or something like that and go on and steal their watch or their wallet or something like that. So where common sense prevailed, if you saw them, not that you were scared of them, if there was 3 or 4 of you, you wouldn't worry about them. But if you were 1 or 2 of you and there's about 10 or 15 of them, you would just avoid them to avoid any possibility of any problems. That's really.
And as a guard, what was probably the most tricky situation you had, if any?
One particular part of the perimeter I did never ever feel comfortable guarding because it was very dark and it was beside the highway and there was a lot of stacked timbers and pallets and stuff like that. So if anybody actually came in, you were, the chances of you seeing them before they saw you sort of thing was pretty remote. But nothing ever happened. But being a young 19 guy, the old hair used to go, certain times you'd walk past certain areas, the old hair used to, get a little bit uncomfortable about it. But I was only a very short period of time as a defence guard in Vietnam. And then I went over to the squadron.
So when you got to the squadron, what happened then?
Well, when we went over, we did sort of like for want of a better word, bit of a basic training course. We went out and done aerial gunnery, learn to fire the guns from the aircraft, learn about the aircraft in that period of time, what our duties would be, opening the doors and pulling back the armour for the pilot to get out of his seat and refuelling it, loading the cargo and how you would load it for the weight factors and stuff like that, and how you would direct soldiers in and out of the aircraft. You'd always have to make very sure that when they came, they followed your instructions. When you direct them out of the aircraft, they went where you said, because if they went round the back, a very good chance they could get hit by the tail rotor. But none of that ever happened. So,
can you describe the aircraft that you were dealing with?
When I first went there, they had what they call a Charlie model, which was one door, and the gunner sat on that side. The gunner always sits on the port side. The crewman was always on the starboard side. Depending on the aircraft is what capacity you could carry. I'm not sure and can't remember what weight the Charlie model could carry. I think it was only about 6 troops. But then we got the newer aircraft, which was called, I think, a H model or Delta model. A Delta, I think it was. Or H. I can't remember what model it was. But anyway, we got all those, and they came directly to Vietnam. So when the Australian government bought them, they came directly from America to Vietnam. And they were ferried from Saigon. They took delivery of them in Saigon, and they flew them to Vung Tau. And on that particular thing, I was a duty crewman on that job. When we got the newer ones, of course, it's like you see where the gunner and the crewman sit in like their own little compartment, and they could carry, I think, in excess of 2,000 pound of weight. And you could either carry it internally or under the aircraft on a hook system. You also had a winch, which allowed you to winch over the jungle. You could winch about 100 odd feet down into the jungle. That was a very small stainless steel cable. and that was also part of our training. We were required to go up to Nuidat, and it's amazing when you learn something, you're taken to a big area where there's a rubber plantation and big trees, and part of your requirement was to actually direct the pilot within about 3 feet of the trees with the rotor. And of course you think, I make a mistake and there are big problems here. So obviously the co-pilot is also watching. So you're directing to the port and you keep telling the pilot, come port, come port. And then when you think you're about 3 foot away from the trees, you say to him, you know, stop, you know. And then he would sit the aircraft down on the ground there, because it was all the clearing, and then they tell you to go out and have a look to see how many feet you're away from the tree. And you get out there and you're about 40 feet away. But to you it looked like it was 3 feet. So you'd come back and hop in the aircraft and the pilot would say to you, is it 3 feet? A little bit more. And he said, well, how much do you think? Well, it's probably about 30 or 40 feet further. I said, well, right, you know, get in the aircraft and then direct over. And then again, you'd come over and still hedge. And when again, he would do the same. He'd stop. Now get out and have a look. And the same thing, you're still probably 15 feet away from it. Then he'd get back in and then the co-pilot would bring the plane right across and then you would see. And it's surprising in a short period of time, you learn to be able to bring the aircraft within such a close proximity of trees. It's unbelievable. So they're all part of the things you had to learn. You know, tying down the aircraft and all those sort of things you had to look for. Rearming the aircraft if you'd used your guns, all that sort of stuff.
I want to go into a bit of the detail of some of those things. Can you tell us a bit more about the training in the gunnery part?
They just took us out over the sea, South China Sea, and they just threw big boxes out the door with marker die attached to it, and then virtually said open fire on it. And with a machine gun, it's an M60, it's more of an aerial weapon, it's not a precision weapon. So obviously it would shoot all around the box. And also you had to learn, of course, the aircraft is flying, so you've got to compensate for that. But we used 100% tracer in the aircraft. Normally the infantry, I think it was about 1 in 5, or maybe 1 in 6, I'm not sure, what the standard rule of tracer per what they call ball round, which is a normal round of ammunition. But we used a 100% tracer because we didn't need to use sights then. We could virtually use the tracer round as like a torch because you would see the round. Even in daylight you could watch the round and you could follow it. And when you watched it, of course, you saw it arch down. I mean, you just did that a few times and then away we went. And we just...
Sorry, yeah.
No, that's what we're talking about. Oh, about that. So basically, once we did all that, because we'd already been basically trained as defence guards, so we knew the weapon inside out. So from then, of course, we went on to operational.
How long did it take you?
Oh, it was only about a week, not even that. Very crash course, very crash course, you know, because we were the first defence guards to go on them. And I think probably the role with that was being that they'd suddenly woken up. Here they have guys that basically trained in infantry work, and here because they had General Hands or anybody before on it, and they thought, well, we've got people here trained for that role, they should be doing it, and that's why they volunteered, and we were the first group to go on. And from then, I think it always became defence guards took on that role, you know. In fact, they'd actually discontinued having the crewmen's, the gunners wing, since the old, I think it was Lancaster bombers and that went out of service, they discontinued that, and they had to bring that back when in my service. So that's why you will occasionally see gunners wings. I mean, I've had old Second World War guys see me who were air crew on Anzac Day, and they see a young bloke and they see this gunner's wing up there, and they sort of look at you with a bit of suspicion. Which is understandable. I do the same.
Had the pilots warned you about what you would likely to be seeing?
No. No, you weren't warned. I mean, you were told you were going to be doing things like medevacs and resupplies and things like that, and you were going to be involved with the SAS, doing extractions and things like that. But no, I don't really remember the pilot saying, "Oh, well, you have to be this." They probably more told us your responsibility to your crew and to the aircraft than anything else. You know, up until that point, we hadn't even lost any aircraft. You know, there was bullet holes in the aircraft and things like that, but there was we had no. Though we had a couple of aircraft, one before I went on that had crash landed, but that was due to engine problems. But generally, no, they didn't tell us. And I think it was probably just accepted that you had a fair idea what could possibly in store for you. You know, and probably the last thing you want to do is to put the fear of God into someone and say, well, this is what could happen. You know, I said you always had that thought in the back of your mind. Well, nothing will happen to me anyway. I'm invincible. I'm 19. So no, never even envisioned the things. You were probably I was more concerned that I would not fulfil my role, and that if the situation did arise of combat or something like that, I mean, I know it was always expected to happen, that I would, for want of a better word, turn tail and want to run. I think that was the greatest fear. As I said, you know, to be trained to do certain things and then to be actually have to fulfil that role in the real sense is then the testing point. And I suppose every guy might wonder how he would react under certain events, whether he, would want to turn tail and run or whatever, or break down and cry or whatever it may be. But I think we all have that think, well, I've been trained to do such and such, will I be good at it? Not the case that I'll be a hero, but will I be good at it? I mean, it's like any profession. A doctor, when he does his training, would assume that he will be the best at that, whatever he's done. So I don't think it's any different from a serviceman's point of view. So,
That gun's pretty big. How did you learn to kind of get that under control?
Well, the M60s on the aircraft are actually mounted on tripods, so there's no problem with that. And being already trained with all that, so there was no drama. You had actually no problem with the guns at all.
Even with the motion of the...
No, because they're on tripods. And the M60 was an aerial weapon, so the requirement for that is, for want of a better word, scare the hell and daylights out of somebody else. It's not a question when you're in the aircraft that, depending on what your role is, you're not ceasing to get a specific target. It's just simply the fact that the guns are there to protect the aircraft and those people on board. It's not there. The gunship's roles were the role to attack in any position. The guns on the aircraft were there to protect the aircraft and to protect the crew for self-defence. Gunships were attack roles. So, the big difference. And medevacs, of course, basically were unarmed aircraft. They were supposed to be unarmed. The Americans did. Their medevacs were unarmed. And technically, when we went in on a medevac, we were not supposed to use our guns, but we didn't have a Red Cross, so if the situation arose, we would use our guns.
What would the attack have been that you would have to...
Well, it could be anything. I mean, you could have been doing a possible resupply and, a VC might want to do attempt an attack. You could be doing a medevac. Somebody's sick and there could possibly be a sniper in the tree. It could be a various things. Your greatest danger for us in Vietnam was when we were working with the SAS. The SAS is where we saw most of our combat, doing with them. Generally, resupplies and things like that, there was no real great danger because you were flying into either battalion or company strength, and they always usually made their areas secure. The only other exception to that is when you did a medevac, when you were called into, say, in a company or platoon or whatever it may have been, had an enemy contact and somebody had been wounded or shot, and they still were trying to stabilise their perimeter, and you were called in to do an urgent medevac. and if you had to winch them out, when that was your danger factor, that possibly there could be some VC or whatever in the area, and they could be waiting to shoot at the aircraft because you're hovering above the trees. So, I mean, you'd like a big sitting duck. And then of course they also basically knew that unless you saw them, you wouldn't be able to open fire because you had all soldiers and you might have a company or a platoon right below you. Unless you could see all of them, if a shot was fired, I mean, with an M60 you just can't retaliate. So basically you would have to see somebody sitting up in a tree. I mean, that never happened to me in that situation, but that's what would happen. So, those are the sort of things that could happen. But the SAS were the most dangerous.
Just before we go into those operations with the SAS, were there any accidents in training?
Not as far as our squadron was concerned. No accidents. There was Army had accidents up there. I mean, like everything else, of course, accidents happen everywhere. But no, we had nobody injured due to accidents while I was with the squadron.
So you said that you said earlier that when you were doing medevacs, that was pretty dangerous because you weren't, in theory, being able to use your guns. How did you sort of cope with that situation?
Well, depending on your medevac, what the situation was in the medevac, you would probably, depending on the situation, because normally a lot of times the area is semi-secured. So, and you knew the guys on the ground were obviously making sure, because if you're over above them and winching up, the last thing they want to do is have that helicopter come down amongst them all, because it's going to make an awful mess. So generally the area is fairly secure. If it wasn't, they would warn us that the area is not 100% secure. Though perhaps technically as a medevac aircraft we wouldn't not supposed to use our guns, but if we saw somebody in the tree trying to take a shot at us, and certainly, unless he's an army guy that got really silly and decided to climb up a tree, he's going to get it. You're not going to allow the aircraft to be endangered.
So how often did that happen?
Medevacs were an ongoing thing, and they varied from different things. My very first medevac, which was something I was absolutely, I suppose when I look back, terrified of, the thought of actually seeing somebody that had been killed, shot or wounded or whatever. How was I going to handle that? Because I'd never seen it. It's in the movies, you see them all, they all die very gracefully and all that sort of thing, and you don't see the drama of it or the trauma. And my very first medevac was an accident. And what had actually happened was a display or an exhibition of firepower of a gunship to replacements or guys that had just come in up at the task force. And what actually happened is there was a malfunction on one of the rockets, and it actually came down amongst all these guys, all these diggers, and 2 of them were killed, very badly mutilated, and quite a few were wounded. The wounded would always be taken out first. KIR or deceased are left to last. It is important that the wounded are brought out first. Normally, obviously, the most critical first, and down the line, and then to the less injured, and then, of course, the KIR or deceased. Unfortunately, on this particular case, I was allotted the job of coming out with the 2 KIA. That was my first experience of a medevac. And as I said, these poor diggers were wrapped up in a poncho. We see all these movies where they have body bags and all that. That's modern day, but then no. So it wasn't very nice. And to see a form there that was originally, a full-grown man, and what you could see was probably half, though we didn't see any blood or anything like that. But what you were looking at was 2 men on 2 stretchers that you probably could have put both of them on the one stretcher. Was a very quick, rude awakening to it. So that didn't go down too well that night. I must admit I spent quite a few hours in the mess that night, having quite a few drinks to get over it. You know. So I sort of got past my first hurdle to say, well, at least, I kept it together. So, and other medevacs I do are different.
What was it about that was so difficult for you? Was it...
Without going into graphics of it, to actually have seen what had been done to two men in a stupid accident. No fault to anybody. A malfunction of a piece of military equipment cost the lives of two servicemen. Where I suppose could have possibly been avoided. But hindsight's a great thing to say, oh, well, if the aircraft had come in from a different direction, or if this had happened and that happened, nobody would have been hurt. But that's great in hindsight. But unfortunately, to see that and see it happen, I think that's probably the saddest for me, is to think an individual has lost his life not because of, enemy action, because of a freak accident, So that was hard to deal with. I mean, the same as, I suppose, for want of a better way of describing it, is, I suppose it's not probably the right way to say it, but I got a certain amount of satisfaction, and not pleasure in the sense when I don't mean enjoy, but to actually bring out guys that had been wounded, because you could physically do something for them. You hold their hand, and I mean, depending on the wound, some veterans even wanted to know if their family jewellery was all right. They were more worried about what their future life was going to be, and if their jewellery was there, no longer there, that life might not be worth living. So you would actually get asked things like that. And, you would be able to hold their hand or do them and say, yeah, mate, it's no problem, you're okay, be right, you'll be at the hospital and thing in a little while, But when you brought out a guy that had been killed in different stages, that's really hard. To sit there it's different. I suppose I don't know how to really say it. It perhaps may be a little bit different from the army guy, and yes, it's one of his mates. But because of the events and everything that's going on, one of their mates has been killed, but they're still under action, and a lot of things are going on. I mean, I would say you'd have to ask somebody who's in that situation. I'm only talking from my aspect. That they may not necessarily have had the opportunity or the way to sit there for perhaps 20 minutes and look at a guy that only a short period was alive and is now deceased. And it's very hard. So you feel a sense of hopelessness. I can't do anything for this guy. What can I do? At least for the guy that's wounded, do whatever you can for him. I mean, I've had a guy in the plane that was one time at night time we did a medevac who'd actually got burnt, and that's a smell you never forget. You ever smell something that's been burnt, you never forget that smell. It's the worst smell you can ever smell. And he actually asked me, he wanted to be sick. Did I have a, bag for him to be sick in? And I just said, there's the floor. I don't have to clean it up. I mean, you have to yell in an aircraft to them, because it's all right for me, I'm at a microphone, but you have to yell at him. But he was more concerned. Here's a guy that's been burned due to something, I don't know what had happened. It was only some form of enemy action. And he was more concerned about messing up our aircraft. It's strange. Strange things, how different things happen. So,
Can you just pause for a second, Cole? Just speaking about that first operation where you had to take out those two men who were killed, how many men were wounded in that incident?
I can't recollect. I think there was probably about 4 or 5, maybe a few more. Some I think were taken to their own medical section. I think there was 3 or 4 that were medevaced out back to Vung Tau for immediate treatment because of their injuries. But I think for one of the minor accidents, injuries, they were then taken to the medical section in Nui Dat for treatment, and probably then later on transported back to Vung Tau.
Were you able to observe the condition of other men who had been involved in that incident, who'd seen it happen?
No, because basically we flew in straight away and picked up the thing. I mean, we could see the chaos that was going on. I mean, as I said, my aircraft came in to pick up the KIA, or the deceased, whereas the other aircraft had gone in to pick up the wounded, so they would have seen, you know, when I went in, virtually it was like a clean-up operation. But the other guys would have taken the wounded guys out.
Were there any other medevac situations where you were taking out wounded that you particularly remember as being significant in some way?
Oh yes, one particular one that stands out very clear in my mind. And it was actually a guy that I knew. At the time I didn't know. There was actually a couple of incidents. One was I was actually on duty as a duty crewman, which I was not normally required to fly on this particular day, and due to some events the CA wanted to fly up to this fire support base. And that was around about the time of the 67-68 Tet Offensive, and we flew up on this spare aircraft, the duty pilot, myself, and I was acting crewman, and another guy was acting gunner. And when we flew up to this particular base, they were already had been under contact, the Army, and they called in medevacs. And one of their aircraft went in, and the guy had got a sniper. The guy, I think, had his nose shot. I don't know what, but it was only a minor injury, in a sense. And apparently the medic was actually treating him, and he got shot by the sniper. The Army did get the sniper, but in the meantime, he actually fired at the aircraft, and he actually hit the aircraft and he severed all the cables. And the bullet went on further and penetrated the vest of the crewman. Anyway, they came back to the fire support base, and reasons unbeknown, that particular crewman did not, at that particular time, feel like he needed to carry on, and I was assigned to continue the medevac with a little bit of complaint, because I was the duty crewman and I deserved to fly back to Vung Tau. But unfortunately, I was reassigned to the aircraft to do the medevac, and we had to actually fly back in. And by that time, of course, they'd taken care of the sniper, so there was no danger. But when we had to winch out both the KIA and the wounded guy. The wounded guy, as I said, I'm pretty sure had a bullet wound to the nose or something. And unfortunately, the guy that was killed was just in a litter, and he wasn't covered up or anything like that. And unfortunately, for that period of time, I sat there with the wounded guy and saw the guy that did. In fact, I knew that man, and I was not aware of it at that particular time because of what was going on, until some time later when I was at the medic down at the hospital and was particularly asking about, I mean, he wasn't a close friend, I knew him during my course of duties, and I'd asked about, I think his name was Blue, where's Blue? And that's when they told me that he'd got killed. And then I'd asked them when and where and what for, and when they did tell me the full details, my knee sort of went a little bit mobbing, and they said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Not really so good." I said, "Because I was the medic aircraft. I pulled him out." So it's always stuck by me, that the fact that I actually knew this guy that had been killed, and you know, even to this day, I clearly see his face. You know, so I think I once said, and I think I said to you earlier, a person once said, veterans live in the past. Unfortunately, the past lives in us. And as much as we'd like things to disappear, they don't. They come back every now and then and haunt us. So it occasionally, I mean, if I was an artist, I could sit here and quite clearly draw the whole thing. you know, and that's 30 odd years ago. And I'm sure Second World War guys and Korean guys have said the same type of things. So, you know, and that, and another one where a stupid operation that was involved with the medevac, where some stupid individual officer, they found a VC camp and decided to mount an attack late afternoon. And one thing about Charlie, he was, and the VC and the enemy, they were pretty game and pretty ferocious at, you know, early morning and especially around dark, because then they knew it was hard to bring in fighters and gunships to bear on them, and they could also disappear quicker too. And we thought, how stupid. We virtually said we were sitting around because we were just due to fly back to Vung Tau. And the word came down from their headquarters to stand by that we might be required for medevacs because they were going to mount an attack. And we all just sat there and said, they can't be that stupid. They will not be that stupid at this time of night or late afternoon. So we basically started getting ready to do medevacs because we knew if they were there, there was going to be a fight. And unfortunately, there was. And anyway, Charlie put up a good fight. He wounded some, one, and then of course we were called to do the medevacs. And we went in to do the medevac, and they had poor communication, which it made extremely difficult to us to winch them out. I was on standby, flying around, waiting to come in to do a medevac. The aircraft that was down trying to winch guys out was not able to communicate properly. They had the guy in the lid and we're telling them that they could winch him up, and they were trying to get a clearance from them, and all sorts of things were going on. And I think unfortunately that guy did pass away. And because then it was almost dark, when our pilot finally got some sort of communication with them, and basically said, because of your communication and the lateness of the hour, it is extremely difficult for us to do the medevacs. Have you any men there that is wounded, that cannot survive or must be taken out now? Or could they, you know, with your treatment there, could they survive until morning until we can improve the communication? Unfortunately, there was one guy. So my pilot asked him, do you have any night flares? Because I said, it's almost getting dark. And he said, yes, we have one night flare. My pilot, I won't use the graphic words that he used, but they weren't very nice. He did call him a lot of ferocious names. And said, well, okay, we're going to come in. And instructed him what was going to happen. And what actually happened was one of our other aircraft went up to a couple of 1,000 feet. And I was on the aircraft that had to go in to winch him out. And we circled away, and they then told them to strike their flare. We turned on all our navigation, all our lights, looked like a Christmas tree, and then went down to treetop level. And the aircraft above us directed us onto that flare, and then we proceeded to winch this guy out. And in fact, we were very, very lucky that we didn't get ourselves wiped out with a big tree. Because if I hadn't looked out the door when I did, we'd have had a bigger love affair with a big tree with a tail rotor. We got that guy out. He had severe head wounds. He was a mess, and which makes me very angry. We instructed our pilot the nature of his wounds and where we should perhaps take him. It was to an American, Benoit, I think it was, at a specialist hospital. I can't remember what unit it was, but they had a lot of, and that's usually where a lot of these head injuries went. We tried to get clearance to take him to that hospital because it was just as far, in a sense, to go that way as it was that way. And some stupid army people said, no, bring him to Vung Tau, which we did. And unfortunately, because of that decision, I'm not saying he would have survived, but they later had to transfer him to where we wanted to originally take him. And unfortunately, he did not survive. So those incidents, and that's probably why sometimes I do not like authority, because of some stupid decisions that were done.
Why did they make that decision?
Informed, or think that was the rule and that's the way it had to be done. I'm not listening to what, for want of a better word, the people on the ground. So they hold great significance in my mind because of those things.
Were the conditions? What was the situation in Vung Tau that he wouldn't have received the same treatment there as elsewhere?
I mean, I'm not saying that the army wasn't equipped, but a lot of top specialists. Because I mean, there was a lot of, anywhere from orthopaedic to all the types of specialists in the world serving in Vietnam in all things. But it was like a specialist hospital where certainly severe injuries would go, and that's what transpired. Burns and things like that. There's different. The Americans were certainly well equipped in their hospital. I'm not saying that our hospitals in Army Hospital was not by any means up to the standard, but perhaps just the nature of his injuries needed that little bit of more expertise.
Was he conscious when you picked him up?
No, unfortunately he wasn't. No.
When the wounded were conscious, you spoke a little bit about this earlier. What sort of things did you say to them when?
Oh, you'll be right. You'll be the hospital soon. Hang on. It'll be right. Even if you knew that their injuries were pretty severe. I mean, you got to learn. Not that we were medically qualified, but you only needed to look at the guy and knew how severe his wounds. But you would never, ever say like, you ain't going to make it or anything like that. You would tell him, look, you're right. It's not that bad, Hey, you'll be going home in a few weeks, and all those sort of things. You did your best to make sure that they were relaxed, for want of a better word. And I think a lot of them probably were, I don't know, I haven't spoken to a wounded guy, but they're probably grateful that they were out of there and they were going to a hospital. Because I mean, really the chances, if they'd been during the Second World, their chances of their survival would have probably been not even 10th of a chance. I mean, when you consider a guy could be very badly wounded in the jungle, and within probably, say, 30 minutes, he can be in an operating theatre in front of specialists and getting the best possible medical treatment. Whereas going back in the other wars, it might be days or hours before they can even get them to a hospital. So the Vietnam War was the year of the helicopter, where you could get soldiers quickly to the field for treatment. And it's probably why the losses are less than what they could have been.
Were there many situations where you evacuated wounded and you later discovered that those people had died?
Oh yeah, because we used to get briefings every morning and every afternoon. So if you did do a medevac, I don't know, I don't think it was morbid curiosity or anything like that. You would generally ask what was the outcome of that medevac. Is the guy okay, or things like that. And obviously if you heard things weren't real good, you didn't feel real happy. I mean, there's different things. I mean, there's another medevac that sort of comes back to the mind, and that happened up in Boral and Camaraderie, where blokes were killed. You had to bring out unfortunately there was 5 killed, and we had to bring them out. And unfortunately, we had a new pilot, and which made me very angry. Trouble is I'm outspoken. Where you were never supposed to carry wounded and KIA together. In these circumstances, they allowed this wounded guy, and he was more stressed to be put on the aircraft. And I ended up with him sitting beside me with my, what we call monkey strap, which is my harness, wrapped around him, because I thought any old minute he was going to do a lily flip and go out the door. And unfortunately we have the wounded there, and unfortunately, which is not so good, that the covers uncovered from what the wounds, and I saw the nature of this person's wound, and unfortunately also his blood was being picked up and sprayed all over my outfit. And that was hard, but I had to more concentrate on this poor guy that was sitting next to me. And for a little while there, I thought he was going to go out the door, because he was a shot case. Fortunately, we got him there and got the word off. I had a few words to the pilot afterwards. I won't go into the graphics of that, but there was a severe word between me and an officer about what I thought.
How often did you see situations where soldiers were coming out of the jungle in some sort of state of shock?
I think probably 2 or 3 times. Probably I suppose it's not a funny issue, but probably one of the funniest medevacs I ever did. This is not, I don't want it to be said as funny, but I remember taking 2 replacements into an operation. It was during Coram Balmoral operation. And there was this guy, and he probably looked a bit like me at that time. I was like a lollipop, skinny, hardly any meat on the bone, tall and lanky, And there was this other guy that looked like he could carry an army on his back. He was about 5 pick handles across the shoulders and about 6'6", and And I saw this little skinny guy get off the chopper where he was going, and I could see his knees just about buckle under the weight of his pack and everything. And this big, like Iron Man get off the chopper and charge off. And it's probably be coming back to get that little bloke soon, because he don't look like he's going to carry that pack for too long. And probably, I don't know, half an hour later or something like that, we get called to do a medevac. And because we know the operational hours and when it was, I turned to my mate and said, that'll be that little skinny guy. He's had heat exhaustion, he's collapsed. So when we get back there, we land, I'm absolutely dumbfounded. Here's this big Iron Man that was, looked like a big gorilla. He's out to it on this stretcher, absolutely heat exhaustion, knocked him over. And I stood there, and as I landed him on, I just shook my head. I thought, I can't believe this. This big, strong guy that you would have thought would have, carried about 6 blokes on his shoulders. And here he was, he got struck down with heat exhaustion. And the little guy, never know what happened to him. He obviously survived it all. So you look at things, and it's sort of funny in a way, but not funny,
What percentage of medevacs were people suffering from heat exhaustion or other illness? Or?
Everything. Anything from, we've done medevacs at night time when blokes have suddenly got appendicitis and, mild heart attacks, dysentery, everything you can name off. It was not very, a lot of the medevacs, sometimes even civilians. You went in and took civilians out, Might be a training group somewhere, and as Vietnamese have been injured, you go and take them out, take them back to the Korean hospital in Vung Tau. So it varied. It was a varied role, Whatever you were called to do, you did.
So you said earlier that you were quite terrified of being faced with seeing somebody who had been killed in action. So what gave you the strength to deal with those sort of situations?
I think, well, it's my job, it's what I've been trained for. I have to accept it. Not to accept it is to be a failure at what I'm to do. I'm, in a sense, letting the team down. I'm part of an air crew. It would be probably a form of disgrace to myself that I couldn't deal with the issue, because sooner or later we all have to deal with that fact of death, whether it's old age or accident or somewhere. So somewhere along the line we're going to have to deal with it. So I suppose that's probably one of the things that, accepted that. You don't necessarily going to get over it. I mean, it probably also brings home the fact that you're not invincible. It could have just as easily have been you. But I mean, you don't dwell on those factors.
Did you have any belief systems that helped you at all?
Say that again?
Did you have any belief system that helped you at all? Any sort of faith in anything, or?
Oh yeah, I was I at that time was a Christian. I believed in an almighty power. I could probably get into arguments with people on the religious side of it, or whether it's a God, Jesus Christ, or whatever, but I say, yes, there's a superpower and whatever may be. Probably there has been times I've questioned why certain things have been allowed to happen, but I basically believe that, you know, we were being protected, and if anything's going to happen, well, it will happen. It doesn't mean that I thought, well, you know, I'll run across, basically like I'd run across the road, and if I got run over, well, it was meant to happen. I wouldn't be that silly, but I basically thought, well, if things will happen, it will happen.
So did you pray at all while you were there?
On several occasions. In certain events, yes. I looked up and thought, yeah, oh God, I hope you're watching over me right now. But I think you get a certain amount of adrenaline that gets rushing. I mean, I could look back and sort of laugh about it now, but I mean, the events are fairly, you know, serious events. But I think you need to look back and sort of laugh about things, not to look at it with a dim and gloom and say, you know, how terrible. Yes, they were terrible, but it's only dwelling on the past, you know. So I can sort of laugh about them, but there was instances where I lost an engine and we thought we were going to crash from 2,500 feet. I looked up at the radar and thought we were going to lose the radar, and I looked across at the crewman, and he looked at me, and we both thought the same thing, and I said, well, I'll see you on the other side. The aircraft got down safely. You know, and the pilot did a perfect, what they call auto rotation. So we got down safely.
What had caused that problem?
In the turbojet engine, there's like a fan system, right? And what can happen, and it was never verified, but what can happen, because when you land a chopper, you're supposed to sort of cool down the engine. So you land and you idle down the engine for, I can't remember now, it might be 4 or 5 minutes. Right? Might even be 10 minutes, I can't remember. And then you would shut the engine down. If the engine is actually shut down too quick, it can cause, from my understanding and memory, a form of metal fatigue and make the blades brittle. And apparently whether that happened or not, but anyway, that's what did take place. The actual tips of the fan blades and the turbo were actually breaking off. And the noise it made, you would have swore that it was the rotor. Now, if you lose the rotor, which is your big blades, that's it. You're like a brick straight down. So that was always your greatest fear. Not losing your engine or getting holes in the aircraft, because you knew you could get, the pilots are trained and well trained, you could get the aircraft down, even crash through the jungle if need be. Whether you will get injured or not was another question, but the aircraft could get down safely, sort of thing. So in those circumstances, you get a little bit nervous. So and that's actually did what happened. The thing happened, then I looked at the pilot, he looked at me, I looked up there and said, okay, see you on the other side. And we actually laughed about it when we got on the ground, because we were talking. I said, you know, I looked across at you and thought, well, I'll see you on the side. He said, you know, that's a bloody funny thing. It's exactly what I was thinking. But we got home safely. No, that's no problem. Yeah.
Were there other situations when you found the need to pray?
I wouldn't really say pray. Basically saying, oh God, you know, look after me, you know. Oh God, what am I doing in this place? I volunteered for this, you know. But I think, you know, I can only relate how I felt and as a 19-year-old and reflect back. But I felt that with what we were doing, and yes, I can remember having my stomach feeling like it was a basketball as we went into an operation, you know, like it was to do with the SAS. And there was suspected enemy there, or was enemy there. But once you went to a certain point whether you were going to require to descend down lower and get your guns and everything ready, then whether it was the adrenaline that started pumping through your system, you didn't really feel any fear. I think it was the fact that you had a job to do, you had to switch your mind on, and do it. The nerve sort of sense come in would be afterwards. You think, God almighty, what the hell were we doing there? But generally, no. Yes, I've been scared, but generally I would probably just say, oh God, make sure you look after me with you.
So how did you calm your nerves afterwards, after a sort of hairy incident like that?
Interesting. Hey, that's a very interesting question, actually, to look back on. Well, definitely after you're flying, it was straight to the boozer, obviously. Maybe go downtown and have a few drinks or do something. Sometimes, actually, we do stupid things in the aircraft. You know, go low level flying, scoot along the beach, on virtually just above the sand. Race down the highway like you're a car. Sometimes even if it was a blue sky and there was a cloud in the sky, go and break the cloud up. All stupid little things. You look back. Chase, go up the river, and the guys on their little sampans going up the river, and you'd be flying about 2 foot off the water, and they'd look around and see the aircraft, and it doesn't lift up. Next thing you see them dive over the side. Probably a lot of guys would say, "What do you say that for?" Well, we did. We did a lot of crazy, stupid things, and I think it was a form of releasing, the form of anxiety, perhaps stress. But we did a lot of crazy things. A mate and I booby-trapped the bloody ablution blocks with flares. We went and hooked them up to the chain. The old days you used to pull the chain. Well, we went and got flares and tied them around the bottom of the bowl and run a wire all the way up. When the guy came in, pulled the chain, he pulled the pin, up went the flare and filled the whole room with a yellow smoke. We thought that was a practical joke. The CO didn't think it was real. Well, basically didn't think it was real funny. And tell anybody who get caught doing that again would be charged. We never told them we'd done it. So, did a lot of silly things. The pilots used to pull, I can't remember a lot of the things, but pilots used to pull practical jokes on us. We pulled practical jokes on them. We pulled practical jokes on the SAS. I remember the SAS one time, they put a sign up on a big building. 9 Squadron takes it up the A, And of course we flew over it. We had a very great comradeship with the SAS because we worked so closely together. There was no way any regular army guy could say anything in front of the SAS about 9 Squadron. He'd like to get his head punched in. That's how the bond was between us. And they were having a go at us. And I remember we were sitting there at our standby hut and discussing what the insult that the SAS had implied upon us, saying that remark, that 9 Squadron takes it up the A. And our CO flew up and came in and he said, "Have you guys all seen what's on that thing up on the SAS hill?" And we said, "Yeah, we're discussing it." He said, "What are you going to do about it?" I said, "We haven't made up our mind yet, but we've got to pay some compliment back." So he turned around and told us. He said, "Well, go down to the medical section and get some condoms." And he said, "Get chloroquine and make water bombs. And go to the kitchen and get some flour and make some flour bombs." So that's exactly what we did. That's what the CO said, so that's what we did. So we went and made all these bombs, and a couple of choppers then took off and went over the top of SAS Hill, and all these SAS guys stood there and looked up, and next thing, water bombs come raining down on top of them. If it had hit anybody, it probably would have killed them. Flour bombs and all. There was one guy, they said he was standing outside a hut, and it dropped this big flour bomb, and it hit the tree, and it just flowered. He looked like Santa Claus. He was absolutely white. It was all done in. They went up there and they painted it out off the roof. Everyone had a good laugh. They had a laugh. And we had to go about the insult that they'd paid upon us, and they laughed. And another time, they were doing a patrol, so they came and must have been across a dead deer outside the barbed wire. It was a foot patrol, so they, in their good wisdom, decided they would bring it back and give it to us. So they made a big pole, apparently, so we find out, and they carried it back. It had been dead for a little while, so you can imagine it was still a bit higher than me. And they actually stuck it inside the chopper and then shut all the doors. Thankfully, it wasn't on my aircraft that I was flying on. But the guys and it was probably there nearly all day. So these guys went out to to fly. And when they opened the door, you can imagine what the smell was. And straight away they knew who'd done it. So they didn't touch it. So they just bared the smell, got in the aircraft, took off, flew over Sass Hill, and then the crewman and the gunner just shoved it out the door. And when it hit the ground, it all sort of everywhere. And then the Sass had to go around with shovels picking up. It was all that. I mean, they're a crazy thing, but they did happen, you know. And again, they did it again. They painted the sign back up. Next time they were waiting for us. They come out with little pencil flares and started shooting at us, like anti-aircraft fire. I mean, I don't know if that sort of thing continued on after my time in Vietnam, but they're the sort of things. And we formed great bonds with the SAS. You know, really did form a good bond with them. You seem to get to know certain groups of them because quite often you would be the one to insert them into the jungle. So you seem to, oh God, you again, you know. We've got to put you back in the jungle. That was quite common. And then sometimes when we were off duty, we would go up and spend the night with them and get drunk with them and things like that, you know. So you had a way of releasing those stresses and anxieties and things like that, you know. And I think you had to.
Okay, can you tell us some of the early operations with SAS and what you were required to do?
The first SAS operation I did, I think it was one of the first I did, nothing untold happened. The requirement, what would normally happen with a SAS patrol is probably a week, maybe a week, prior to the patrol of 5 men, or if it was an ambush patrol, it could be 10 men, going into a jungle. They would fly over the area that they were going to reconnaissance, you know. And they would basically have 9, if my memory is serving me correct, 9 grid squares that they would work within on the map, right? And usually whatever 9 squares, it would be the bottom left-hand corner square would be where they would start. So that would depend where they were going to be inserted into the jungle. They were always inserted into the jungle, into a clearing, to a landing. Never winched out or winched in, they were always dropped in. So a week before, say, roughly, they would go with one of the crews, they would fly out over the area and they'd look at the maps and they'd confirm and say, yep, want to go in there, we want to go in that place there, that little spot there, and they'd mark it on the map and that pilot that they were with, he would be the lead aircraft because he knew exactly where they wanted to go. And then they would just fly over it. They wouldn't circle it, they'd just fly over it and keep going and do a big circle, and then they would just go back to the thing. Then about a week later, when the operation was going to take place, their patrol would come down with all their equipment and their weapons and stuff like that, all blackened and all that. And as I said, a lot of times it was guys that you would, more than not, it seems rather strange, it was as if they became your personal group. And when it was your time to, or when it happened that you were inserting in patrol, it would quite often happen, it was at patrol. And then the next time it happened, you might be on the resupply aircraft or the lead aircraft, and you didn't need that patrol. But it just seemed that you put one patrol in one group of guys as a team more than others. So you formed another sort of bondship with them. So then what would happen is then they'd come down, you'd go into a briefing hut, and there'd be a full briefing. The lead aircraft would say what's happening. The aircraft that was putting him in knew their role, and then the spare aircraft, which was in case of an emergency, would be told that he was required to circle off so far away. And then after everything was clear what was happening and what was going on, then you would go out to the aircraft. Of course, everybody would take off. The lead aircraft obviously would be, in a sense, following. And when you're getting close to the area, if you were the inserting aircraft, you would be told to drop down, which meant straight down to treetop level. And I literally mean you looked out the door and you saw trees above you out the door. you know. And then that lead aircraft would guide you through the communications, and he'd be saying, you know, turn port, turn starboard, and he would be giving you the distance. You know, it's 4,000 metres, approximately 4,000 metres. So he's directing you up to that landing zone. And of course, you're in the aircraft as part of the crew, you hear everything that's going on. And at a certain point, you know, it's virtually basically when you hit the treetop levels, you set your guns and everything ready. You're not expecting anything at that point in time. But as you're coming in to land, and you know that, you know, it's getting down close to that area, you know, it's 2,000 metres to go, you know, 1,500, 1,000 metres, and then they'll tell you, you're coming up to the clearing now, and then suddenly you'll fly over trees and you're there. And that's immediately then you start watching everything. And then the aircraft is directed. You basically don't even touch the ground. Yeah. Aircraft drops down, virtually touches the ground. They're out. They race off into the trees, and if all goes well, you just take off, and away you go. Then you fly away. It might be 15, 20 kilometres away. Not that far away, really. And then you would circle for about 30 minutes. All the aircraft would circle. And that's what I said, you might do some stupid things. Go and break up clouds. Fly up into a cloud, keep breaking it up. You physically break a cloud up, you know. That was a way of relieving yourself. And all the time you're listening to the radio, waiting for that sound that you don't want to hear, which is the emergency beacon. So once if they hit that emergency beacon, that means they've made contact, and that means you've got to go back and get them out. But normally after, you know, if they're in for 30 minutes and nothing has happened, they usually know, and then you fly off back to Vung Tau, or back to the task force, or carry on whatever you're doing. If you're doing resupplies, you go back to doing that. But all the time your radios is set on that frequency for their emergency beacon. And the moment they hit that beacon, then that's like everybody is summoned. Doesn't matter what happens, you are summoned immediately to that end. The first aircraft, the closest aircraft heads to that area and makes contact with them, you know. But as I said, normally if they get in, they're supposed to stay in probably maybe 5 days. Nothing might happen for a day or two. Nothing may happen for the 5 days. But if they got chance, usually on the last day, if they run into an odd Charlie, they try and take him out, you know. And then occasionally then the expression, all shit would have let loose because he had some mates just down the track. And that happened on numerous occasions. But they would have an emergency beacon. And the moment that thing, and it's a sound, you hear it, it got really ear-piercing, and everybody converges. If you have any equipment or supplies on board, you head for the nearest safe landing zone and just throw it out. You could even have the brigadier of the task force, which I have been on an aircraft that had that. We had the brigadier of the task force on board, and we literally threw him out at a fire support base. Leaned over and tapped his aide on the shoulder and said, "You're out. The SAS is in trouble. We got to go. And we're dropping you at such and such." He told the brigadier, his message came back, "Go for it, get me down quickly." We dropped him off and away we went. And the brigadier actually asked, when we eventually came back, did we get him out, did we get the guys out safely? So it was good to know that he actually was concerned, so, you know. But...
what was the most dramatic rescue SAS mission that you were on?
The worst rescues were actually the fact when you had to winch them out. Because you'd always try and get them to a clearing. But there was the occasion that Charlie knew they were there in the area, like they knew they were there, they just couldn't find them. And they would say, well, like, we're virtually surrounded. We can't get to that clearing. You've got to come in. Which then meant that we had to go in and winch them out. So then what would happen is, once they basically locate where they are, they would be told to fly, throw a flare. Right? Our pilot would immediately identify it with them. If it was a red, green, yellow. Once he verified correct, then if anybody else threw another flare, bad luck for him, because he was going to cop it. And then immediately what would happen is an aircraft would be directed right over the top of them, and then the gunships would come down both sides firing rockets and their miniguns, and they would strafe both sides of you, because you'd be sitting right over the top of that patrol, and they would strafe each side, and you also would be strafing all the jungle, you know, not specifically aiming for anybody. It would be literally just doing burst. The pilot would also be moving the aircraft back and forth, because the guns would only, and which Charlie found out, would only bear so far to the front, which it did. There's a photo in the museum in Canberra of a squadron leader Cox, where one of the VC tried to shoot him, because they knew if they can get it in front of the aircraft, they had free rein. So then the pilots used to do is just keep rotating the aircraft, and that way the guns kept bearing all areas. So you just sweep the area, unless you did actually see somebody. So, and the gunships, as I said, would do a streak that way, then they would come the other way. And usually F4 Phantoms, American F4 Phantoms, would be moseying around fully armed and fully loaded with every, you know, napalm and bombs and God knows what else. And as soon as they heard that there was something going on, boy, they wanted to come in beside you and drop everything, and your pilots would have to say, well, hang on a minute, let's get them out, let's get out of here first. But I can assure you, once you winched them all out of the jungle, which maybe take 5 minutes or something like that, and I think, you know, once you got on the aircraft, we'd take off and they'd just radio to the F4 Phantoms, it's all yours, and they would just come in and literally drop everything they had in one big hit. Yeah. So if anybody was still there, there was a good chance that they weren't going to think, but that happened. It's basically the same things happened, you know.
Was there ever a time where you couldn't get a SAS man out?
No.
Or that they came back with one less?
No, we never lost. In my time, we never lost a SAS patrol, or did we never fail to get them out. And that's where the bond, I think, forms between 9 Squadron and SAS. They knew at all costs. I mean, I did one SAS extraction that was on dark, because they would never have survived the night. There's Charlie were there, and they knew that they were there, and we had to get them out. And we virtually did it on dark. Yeah. And another time, that was during the Tet Offensive, that we actually put a SAS patrol in, and they no sooner got in the jungle line when they hit their beeper. We weren't even 200 feet up in the air, where we had to turn around and go straight back in, and we landed. And the guys come running out of the jungle, and they said it was full of them. And we threw the thing. And in fact, I even stopped firing my gun to allow the guy to get past me. And as soon as he got in my job, he basically yelled in my ears, "Don't stop firing." He said, "They're alive in there." And they were actually, we tried, I think on that particular day, tried to put 2 or 3 patrols in this particular area, and were never successful. In fact, they even tried one time to go out through the battalion lines to go into the area, and there was that many. And that was the time they were doing that big push in 1967-68 down to Saigon. So they struck a lot of them. So that was hair racing, to virtually take off and then turn around and go straight back in. So, you know. Yeah. But we never lost a patrol. We knew always where they were, and they knew at all costs we would get them out. So that's why I said, and all the time I was there with them, if you weren't 9 Squadron and you were just an airman, and we had some of these SAS guys down at our canteen drinking, and you started rubbishing 9 Squadron, you used to go, "Oh my God, no." You'd have to say, don't. They'd want to tear their heads off. They would literally walk up to them and say, "You're insulting 9 Squadron. If you insult 9 Squadron, you insult us. And if you wish to take it further, come outside." You know? And used to say, no, don't. So, you know, so we had a very good, we used to have time off. And because of the situation, sometimes we'd have with standbys and rosters, we could sometimes have virtually 2.5 days off. Even though we were on duty, we wouldn't be required to fly. But on occasions when the way the system worked, you had a day off, you would go up to Sass Hill. And what you'd do is spend the night there, and you would go and buy a carton of beer, because usually the patrol would say, oh, when are you going to come up and spend the night and watch a movie and have a beer with us? Because they used to come down to us. Because what happens every time now and then, when the night dust-off crew were staying, SAS guys used to get leave to come down, and they'd fly down with us, and they'd stay in the bunks of the guys that were on duty that night, and they'd get on the beer with us. And normally, I can't remember whether they were allowed to go downtown or not, but I know they used to get them in the boozer with us and get drunk, you know. So,
What were they like, the SAS guys, compared to other army blokes?
unique, special breed. I mean, I think their comradeship was probably a lot greater. I mean, Sass Hill was a restricted area. The regular army guys were not permitted to go up there. It was a restricted area. So we used to go, we were the only people allowed up there. And as I said, the way the rosters, we'd get a carton of beer, and we'd say, yeah, next time I'm off duty, I'll fly up, and you let them know, you know, you get it through the system. Yep, I'm not flying such and such, I'm coming up. And, you know, that aircraft might be flying back to Vung Tau, and so you'd have a carton of beer on board, and they'd drop you off at the task force up at Sass Hill. They'd be there at the landing pad waiting for you, and then take you up and get up to the boozer, and they'd be happy that you'd brought a carton of beer as well, and you get on, have beer, have some meals with them, go and watch a movie, then go back to the hut and start drinking again. One time I did that, one of the guys showed me my bunk, and another guy collapsed on it, and I'm staggering around in the middle of the night trying to find somewhere to sleep. You know, that was good fun. And their greatest desire was to put us back on the aircraft the next day drunk. They were happy they could put us back on the aircraft next day drunk, you know, and which on numerous occasions they did. And then our crew would take revenge on us because they'd play lullaby all the way back to Vung Tau. They would fly like that, swaying back and forth. And when you're not in the best of weathers, there's not much fun. And you just look at them and say, don't do this to me, you know. But it's another way, I think, of relieving the boredom and the bonding of friendship.
So what was Sass Hill like? Can you describe that layout a little bit?
It was just like a pimple, really, in the task force. It was hill, and that's where the SAS were. And it was a restricted area. It was, you know, barbed wire all around it. They had signs down on the bottom, you know, restricted area. Unless you had permission to go up there, from my understanding, army guys could be charged for going up there without permission. And it was just like anywhere, just like really in the task force. I think there's a photo there I've got that shows it. And you just had tents and stuff like that. Obviously, because of the nature of their service, it was restricted, what their operations were. You know.
When you say they were unique, in what way were they unique? What were their personalities like?
I think in a lot of ways they were average guys, but they were so well trained. You know, they could fill each other's role, whether it be a medic, radio man, or things like that. And I suppose they probably have that traditional Anzac rogue, vagabond spirit, I suppose. It's probably another way of describing them. But they were no different to us. We enjoyed each other's company. They respected us. We respected them. We worked well together, enjoyed each other.
How did they talk about Charlie?
I don't think generally we didn't have much respect for Charlie. I have respect for the North Vietnamese. They were soldiers, no different from us, fighting for what they believe in. The politics of it still don't come into the matter. But the VC is the same way as I view the IRA. They're guerrillas and thugs. Now, the average Vietnamese, all he wanted to do was look after his rice paddy, raise his family, and really he didn't care too much about what else was going on. He wasn't on one side or the other. Right? If he could work for the Americans, get paid money, he was quite happy to do it, or the Australians. The hardcore VC were indoctrinated, and the atrocities that they would do to their own people just because they wanted to live neutral. Just because the village chief said we want to be left alone, we don't support the war, we don't care whether you rule the country or they rule the country. Really all we're interested in this, maybe it's a 2 mile square around the village that belongs to them sort of thing. That's all they're interested in. So, you know, and that's all they cared. Some villages, of course, were strong VC sympathisers. But the Australian Task Force, on 2 occasions, we moved those villages within close range of the task force so they could watch over it.
What were the American soldiers like? How did you relate to them?
The pilots?
Generally.
Oh, some were complete idiots. But a lot of them were great guys. We had some good fun with the Americans. And I think, and I probably should say the same about, Americans could say the same about some of us Australians. We're morons and idiots and loudmouths. I mean, that's in all country, but it depends where you went. I mean, we went up to one time to an American base where they'd never even seen Australians. They didn't even know there was Australians in the country. Didn't even know there was Australians in the country, you know. And we actually got one of their officers drunk, intelligence officer, because we were actually, it was closest to operate out of this American base. And we'd often in Vung Tau been told, oh, a rocket attack, mortar attack coming, and 9 times out of 10 it never happened. And we were standing down, all these Americans said they hadn't seen any Australians. And we're all there in this hut that had been provided for us, and we took out trunks full of beer and everything, because we were going to be stationed there for a while, so we took up our own canteen sort of thing. Of course, they're all standing out the door and we're sitting inside drinking Australian beer, and they're all frothing at the lips because they want to get their hands on it. They're offering to buy it and all sorts of things, and can they have a drink? And it was just made a rule, no, if we give to one, we'd have to give to all. So it was, no, this is all we got, and sorry, no, if we give to you, we've got to give to him, and if we sell it to him, we can't do this. And so it was never done. But we had a officer come around, and we were probably about 7, 8 o'clock at night, and she said, oh look, we're just coming to give you a briefing that there's going to be a rocket attack tonight, probably early hours in the morning. And because we're sort of half tanked, told him in uncertain terms what he could do and where he could go, because we've heard that bullshit before and therefore piss off sort of thing. And then one of the things got the brain idea that we might start him having a drink, and so one of the pilots said, oh, come on, why are you here, have a drink with us? So when he sat down, everybody went nod, nod, wink, wink, let's get him drunk. So that's what we proceeded to do. So we got this officer drunk, you know. Oh, come on, no, don't go yet, have another beer. And he did. When we put him out of the hut, he was drunk. I don't know if he ever got into trouble, but I'm sure as hell he was happy. And he was dead right. At bloody 2 o'clock in the morning, in came the rocket attack. And to this day, I cannot sleep on the bottom of a double-decker bunk. You know double bunks? I cannot sleep on the bottom one, because that's exactly where I was sleeping when the rocket attack hit. And I rolled off that bunk and under that bed and against the wall, and I don't reckon I touched the floor between rolling over until I landed on the floor. I reckon 3 feet I travelled under that bed and I didn't touch the ground. From dead sleep to wide awake, and I reckon the guy in the top bunk, no sooner was I on the ground and he was beside me. And then we waited, and then when it all stopped, we raced outside, we went to a bunker, and it was full of Americans. It was only standing room only outside, and we thought, well, this is a bit sticky. So we promptly turned around, walked back into the hut and sat down and started drinking again. So, we never ever see that American officer again, actually, but that's what happened. And then some traumatic events took place the next day. So,
Were you there for the next day?
Yeah. And that's when actually, I can't remember, it was Coral or Balmoral operation started, where the task force was attacked. And that's where actually 5 guys were killed. And that was rather a dramatic episode. And I actually got a mortar shell where I dug out from right beside a guy's hoochie. You could see his hoochie, it looked like Swiss cheese, but he was all right. There's about 20 of us, because when we came, we walked around, and there was other things I won't go into, but there was so they go, geez, you were lucky. He said, where did your mortar, because we saw his tent, his hoochie. He said, I was there. I said, where did the mortar land? He said, right there. As you can see this little round hole in the ground. I said, oh, yeah. He said, the tail fin will be there. Oh, okay. I might dig that out. And I actually have it here. So I dug it out. And it was probably down about 8 or 9 inches in the ground. And anyway, I thought, I'll keep this and take it home to remind me how close this bloke was. Anyway, unbeknown to us, the engineers were going around to where all of these mortars landed, and they were digging up these tail fins to see what they were, whether they were communist mortars or American mortar shells or whatever, and what size they were by the tail fin. There's about 10 of us standing around when this guy said, oh, where'd the mortar land? Oh, over here. And there's 10 of us standing there. And all these guys had been there when I dug this thing out, and I'd already had it in my gear. And here's these engineers digging to get this mortar shell. And we're all standing there watching him with their arms folded. And nobody said nothing. And they're digging, and they dug down about 18 inches into the ground. I said, geez, this one where to lie. Nobody told them, just let them keep digging. And after they left, we all started laughing how they dug down into the ground looking for this mortar shell, and we already had it out of there. You know, they hadn't twigged. You know. So that was.
So where did that come out of, that conflict? What happened that day?
What actually we'd flown that fire support base in during the day, and unbeknown to us or to anybody, there was a North Vietnamese regiment which had come down from north, if my memory is serving me correctly, and they were, for want of a better word, bivouacked in the tree line. And apparently from captured documents or captured prisoners later on, I said I'm only trying to go back by memory, that that was ascertained that they actually stayed under cover and watched us fly in and out all day with personnels and Chinooks bringing in guns and everything like that, without being detected. And in the early hours of the morning, they then attacked. And fortunately or unfortunately, for whichever way you want to look, fortunately for us, unfortunate for them, they attacked across an open field where the 105s were. And what they did when the attack, I don't know how the attack was detected or whatever happened, but they were trying to overrun the guns, and they did actually overrun 1 or 2 of the guns, and they got taken back by the guys, but they lowered the guns down and they fired like shotgun shells, which is what they call splintex. So they were able to destroy the thing, because when we flew in early that morning, we saw all the bodies of the soldiers. All the thing, wonder what the hell had happened, and we found out when we landed what had actually transpired. So very fortunate. And then there was ongoing operations from Borrell and Coral after that.
Did you have to take those bodies out?
Yes, I did. I took 5 out. And that's where I actually got covered in blood from one of them, and got into a dispute with the pilot about something, because he was a new pilot. And some of the pilots, when those sort of things happen, they wouldn't look at the back. We'd have to be taking care of that, and they just look straight ahead. And being the outspoken person I was as a young fella, I had a few words to say. He threatened to charge me actually over an issue, and I told him to go ahead. I told him the CO would be probably very impressed to hear my side of the story, considering I've been here a lot longer than you have, though you may outrank me.
What did you do wrong?
It was probably an unwritten law, and it probably wasn't fact. Out of a sign of respect, we would normally always bring out 2 KIA at one time. Right? We would bring in 2 stretchers and bring them out. And I certainly felt a lot more comfortable with that. I didn't care about Vietnamese or VC. I didn't care if you stacked them up inside the aircraft like boxes. It didn't worry me. But our own troops, they were to be respected. And in this particular situation, we actually loaded 4 or 5 on board. And I won't go into any specifics about that, but we did. And that greatly offended me.
Because they'd have to be stacked.
That's correct. And that was a sign of disrespect. And then to put a wounded, virtually a shell shock case in beside me, which was that was a no-no, you know. He could have quite easily decided to, do something stupid and jump out the aircraft. He could have taken me with him, because obviously I'm going to try and stop him. But, and then, as I said, in the circumstances. And then, of course, he also saw the injuries that this guy has sustained, which wasn't very pleasant, because they were head injuries. I'm trying to sort of put the poncho back over this guy, not that I was upset physically or, sick or anything, but I'm trying to cover it up, and I'm having, blood all over my flying suit and stuff like that. Not that that deterred me. I mean, that's not an issue. The fact that this poor guy is sitting right beside me and this is happening, it's certainly unsettling him,
How did you not get sick?
I don't know. It's a strange, I've seen some horrific injuries. That's probably one of the reasons today I will not stop at car accidents. If I'm the first there, yes, I will certainly stop and help. But if it's a car accident, I don't need to stop, I don't even bother. Because unfortunately, I know what's going to happen. It's going to bring back stuff to me that I don't want to revisit. Instead, I'll again reflect on the fact that I say the past lives in us, and I don't need to have it brought out unnecessarily. I don't know. I suppose you just accept it. I mean...
Barrett, you went home to Australia on leave while you were in Vietnam?
Yes, I did actually.
How was that trip?
It was good because I actually was writing to a girl, and I can't even remember how that came about. It might have been just before I left or something. One of my friends, it might have been his girlfriend's girlfriend or something. If I'd have probably had the opportunity to go to America on leave, which we weren't able to, or Hawaii or somewhere like that, I don't even think Japan was on our list. I think it was Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan, I think, Australia. I don't know if there was any more. But anyway, I thought, well, I don't necessarily want to think, and I was saving up to want to buy a car, so I thought, oh, well, I'll come home. Parents sort of wanted to see me sort of thing. So I said, oh, well, I'll go home on leave.
So your visit back here, your week-long visit here, actually made you more desirous of being back in Vietnam?
Yeah, I just want to get back. I would have told my parents that. I told them the opposite. I wish I didn't have to go back. The fact was I was quite happy to go back.
So to what extent did you personally observe any of those atrocities committed on the Vietnamese civilians?
I didn't actually see the atrocities, but I saw some of the, when they were brought out. But because of my role in aircraft, where the army guys would see it, and some of the army people would tell us about things that happened. Sometimes it would come down in a briefing that a village chief in such and such an area was slaughtered and things like that. I mean, those things used to get around, the atrocities.
And what sort of aftermath did you have to deal with involving civilians?
Oh, several occasions. The Vietnamese went into areas where they weren't supposed to be and got ambushed and had to bring them out. The ones that had been killed, brought them out. Sometimes you did good things, or there might be a medical outpost or treatment centre or somewhere in one of the villages or little forts. One of their family might get sick, or a woman's having a baby and she's got problems. They'd fly in and bring an aircraft in and take them out. So you'd fly them back to the Korean hospital in Vung Tau.
What would you say was the toughest thing about your time in Vietnam?
I suppose to a certain degree would be not having access to direct communication to home like they have today. Not being able to say, ring up and say like, hey mum, I'm fine. And being the fact that you knew that they were not, you know, the media was not publishing the truth, and thinking that, you know, some events that you may be involved in that are going to be, you know, made very dramatic and blown all out of proportion, and then suddenly, you know, your parents are going to be in your family, and that are all going to be worried that, you know, you've been blown up or killed or whatever, where in actual fact, basically probably nothing greatly happened. So not having that ready access to go, well, look, pick up the phone or the mobile and say, look, mum, it's all rubbish, I'm fine, nothing happened, I'm okay. I think that's probably one of the things. And I suppose the other fact that you could just jump on a plane and go home if you were sick of the game, you know. So yeah, it was. But I certainly don't regret my service in Vietnam. I had a lot of good times, I had a lot of good fun over there. I flew a lot of hours, you know, and I visited a lot of different parts around Vietnam.
During that Tet Offensive, how much did that affect you where you were?
Well, I was pretty fortunate that because I was actually, when the Tet Offensive, I was actually due, prior to the Tet Offensive, I was actually due to go to Penang. And when it looked like just before it started, it sort of blew up and it got a little bit thing, and we were told by because you put your name down to go on this R&C. And that was a bit of a junket trip, and perhaps I could tell you a bit about that later. But anyway, so I had my name down to go, and myself and another guy, we were due to go. And because of things that were happening, we were told by the CO that there's a possibility that you won't be able to go. You'll have to probably go on the next one because things look like they're going to start getting a bit hot with the Tet Offensive. Anyway, subsequently, it quietened down. And the boss said, well, you can go, nothing. They're going to have a truce and it'll be all fine. So off we went over to Penang on the Caribou. And I think a day or two after we got over there, the Tet Offensive started. So we sort of a little bit happy about that thought that we were out of there for that. But that was only for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days. And then we were sort of thinking, oh, maybe it'll be all over by the time we get back. But it wasn't. So when we flew back right into the middle of it or the tail end of it. And things got a bit lively. You know, we flew over Saigon and saw complete suburbs in Saigon that we'd flown over a week or two before no longer existed, completely flattened and burnt out. So some of that sort of things was a bit of a surprise. And then to sort of go back into operations, not being the fact that you'd sort of been away from it for that little bit, it sort of broke your momentum, and then suddenly you were trying to catch up with what was going on.
So how were operations affected by that Tet Offensive? I mean, you said it was a bit livelier. What was the situation?
Well, what actually, the Tet Offensive, that actually, for the Australians, the Tet Offensive was outside of the Vung Tau province. And not actually prior to the Tet Offensive, I'd flown up there with some big brass from the army for a conference, which turned out to be exactly where the fire support base was established. And subsequently what it was supposed to be, that they were blocking, wanting the Australians to come up in this area and be a blocking force for Saigon for the Tet Offensive. And their argument was that we'd been through all this area and there's nobody there, we just want you there in case somebody tries to come through. So anyway, the Australians came up out of the Vung Tau province into this area, and there was certainly more Charlie there or North Vietnamese and all, than was expected. Charlie and the North Vietnamese got one hell of a surprise because that was probably the first time in that area they'd ever run up against Australians. And of course, not like the Americans, they wander down the tracks like a bunch of Brown's cows to a certain degree. The Australian, as a typical jungle fighter, went through the jungle and really caught Charlie napping. And our casualties, I think, were pretty low during that Tet Offensive, considering the operations.
And were you involved in those operations there in any way?
Yeah, I did the resupplies and medevacs, and that's the one actually where I knew the guy that had got killed. And that's also the SAS insertion one where I tried to put a patrol in and had to go virtually take off and go back again and get stuck into it again. And then general resupplies and other things.
So how hairy were those situations? Were you under fire all the time? I mean,
the medevac wasn't under fire because they'd taken care of the sniper, the other one was. But Charlie was a terrible shot. He only used to hit the tail end of the aircraft when it was flying. And then again, I suppose, the fact that I'm firing an M60 machine gun would pretend to keep anybody's head down. You know, and all I was concerned about was protecting the crew and myself, and we got away safely. Whatever was happening, whether I hit anybody or not was totally irrelevant, and wanted to know whether I'd actually killed anybody, it was never of any great interest to me. Yeah, some people say, oh, this and that, or do you ever wonder? I said, no, I don't need to wonder. But I can sure as hell say I put the fear of God into quite a few of them.
what was it like, though, to be under fire yourself?
I think I suppose it's a problem of a wrong way to describe, but it was probably an adrenaline rush because your adrenaline was pumping and you know, you had a job to do. And I think that other factor comes in that you're invincible. You're 19. If you ask me to go back and do it at my age now, I'd probably think some of these things, I'd think, hang on a minute, we've got to think about this, we've got to approach this in a different aspect, you know. We've got to use a bit of logic in this, but at that point in time, no. You know, and we had a, like an armoured helmet, you know. We had a chicken plate and a strap, you know, the vest and everything. So, you know, barring the fact that he shot down the aircraft, it had to have been a good shot to get you, though they did get some of our people eventually, but virtually they'd have to have hit you in the throat or the face or something like that, because you knew the armour vest was going to pretty well protect you from small arms fire. It certainly wouldn't from 50 calibre or a rocket, but you knew from small arms fire that your chest and everything, your main part of your body was pretty well protected. Yeah.
Can you tell us about leaving Vietnam and how you came to come back to Australia?
Well, I flew, which I wasn't supposed to, up until the very last day I left Vietnam. It might have been the 4th or 5th, I mean, without checking records, probably the 4th or 5th of June, the day before, I actually did a SAS insertion. And I suppose I could relate to a bit of that in the fact that I wasn't even supposed to be flying. You were actually supposed to stop flying about a week before. Because of events, they didn't have enough crew, and being that I'd been off on due to a flu thing, I said, okay, I'll fly. And subsequently they had a SAS insertion to do. And I was up there, and at that particular time I was on a spare aircraft. And I'm sitting there thinking, tomorrow I'm not going to be here. I'll be heading back to Australia. I really have no interest in this. And I'm listening to the briefing and say, well, I'm in spare aircraft, I'm going to be circling off down the road. I have nothing to worry about. Unbeknown to me, that wasn't going to happen. As we walked out to the aircraft, the boss said, as I said, they called us by our first name, says, Barry, get your flight crew and you're going to put the SAS patrol in. And I just looked at him and I said to him, you're joking. I'm flying home tomorrow. You are seriously joking. You are pulling my leg. He said, no. That other crew, the other gunner is new. At this point in time, I want experienced crew, so therefore you're putting them in. And I said, you've got to be joking. I said, you know, I don't like that idea. My luck's not that good. You know, if anything's going to happen, but this is going to be it. You know, I said, you can't do this to me. And he said, no, you'll be right. I said, okay. So I went around to the other crewman that was, he went to take his chicken plate off the aircraft. I said, you leave that there. He said, why? You ain't going to need that. You leave it there. I'm going home tomorrow and I want all the protection I can get. So I went and pinched another one from another aircraft and I put one on the seat. And I said, if you're going to shoot me, they're going to have to be accurate. So I put one on the seat, I put one behind me and put me front of them and a jacket. And I reckon if a leaf had barked at me in the tree, I would have shot it. So I went away and did it. And I did the operation, nothing happened. It went uneventful. But I swore that, you know, if anything was going to happen, today was going to be the day. And of course the next day, hopped on an aeroplane, flown to Saigon, put on a chartered aircraft, flew back to Australia, got in it, I think we stopped over in Darwin for an hour or two. We flew into Sydney, and within 30 minutes we were dispersed to all parts of the country and basically told, excuse me, Ren, don't tell anybody where you've been. And because of the events that were taking place, from that day forward, I never ever wore my uniform in public after I got spat on. Never wore my uniform in public again. And I value that uniform with pride. But from that day forward, after I got spat on, I didn't wear it because I vowed and declared if another person ever spat on my uniform, they were not going to be on this planet any longer. And I think I was pretty serious in my thoughts about that. So, you know.
Can we just pause there for a second? So can you just tell us a little bit more about that incident and what happened?
What's that?
I'm sorry?
What was it? What?
Oh, you were talking about the incident of being spat on.
I certainly we probably blocked a bit of it out of my mind. I think, just somewhere in town, some young people, you know, who were probably obviously Vietnam, just spat on me, you know. And I think that's, you know, blame the fact, you know, as I said, like being accused of, you know, killing innocent people and all that sort of thing, and that, you know, being a warmongrel and you know.
When you say in town, where were you, in fact, when that happened?
I'm not sure if it was actually in Brisbane or out at Ipswich. I think it was probably most likely in Brisbane area. And I don't even know why I was in there in uniform, actually.
Were you alone or with somebody else?
I think I was alone, by myself, going somewhere to do something. I may have been in there on some military reason or whatever. I was in uniform, you know. So I just, as I said, from that day on, I thought, no. You know, and I think it also came through that it was recommended that servicemen don't be seen in town in uniform because of the anti-war movement, because it started to really, you know, end of 68, I'd say it started to build up over the next few years until, you know, and obviously got worse right up until the 70s then when, you know, when there was all these really big protests and stuff like that, you know. I just consider them a bunch of ratbag radicals who didn't really value their opinion anyway, because they didn't have the guts to front up when the battalions marched home. If they'd have believed in what they thought, they'd have been there to meet the ships and then let's see what happens. But they didn't. They never fronted up when the troops were there. So, you know, I have no problem with people speaking their mind and have their value. They don't believe in a war and why the government has sent us there, well, that's fine. But be open and stand up for it. You know.
So what sort of effect did all of that have on you, do you think?
Well, I think part of it would be that we didn't get any recognition. And I'm not talking heroic recognition. A serviceman serves his country. And I think I said it before. He serves his country to do his duty. The politics, what a serviceman does, has absolutely nothing to do with it. And if he serves his country with honour, right, then when he comes home, he should be also welcomed with honour that he has returned to the country safely. Not that he's a hero, that he has returned to this country safely. And to virtually say, thank you for serving our country with honour. You know, I mean, you don't want our country to be disgraced. You know, what reflects on our flag is our country. You know, to show dishonour to that shows dishonour to the nation. So, you know, I tend to get a little bit upset, and I could probably talk for quite a long time on those issues. I don't like politicians. They're two-faced. They say they represent the veteran and they will do this and do that. They don't. So, you know, and some authorities I don't respect. I hate someone tells me that he was a general or he was a colonel, you know, a colonel in the army or the squadron leader or whatever he was. Therefore, because I was only a baggy ass, he knows better than I do. Well, sorry, I don't accept that argument. I don't accept people who tell me they're educated people, so therefore, because they're an educated person, I should listen to what they got to say. I spoke to that regard.
At that time, as a young man, do you think that whole reaction, how much do you think that reaction affected you and your return to Australia and how you dealt with coming back?
Well, I mean, I think the fact that you also, the secrecy and you weren't welcomed home with honour, you know, for a job well done, you know. And it's like the fact when you hear people say, oh, you lost the war, or it was a war you would never win. Well, that's not true. We weren't allowed to win. So to say that to me as a Vietnam veteran is an insult. You know? And I mean, there's been a common saying that I've seen around, and it is true. When I left, we were winning. And we were. If anybody in this country should hold their head in shame, right, it is all those people that stood up and protested against the Vietnam War in public. I have absolutely no problem if you wish to bombard your member of parliament or do anything like that, but to go on the open media and condemn what your fellow servicemen are doing overseas is an insult to our nation, you know. And to drag the service of our armed forces into the political arena is also an insult to our nation, you know. And also to use our armed forces for political reasons is again an insult to our nation, you know.
But isn't that what often happens? Isn't that what war is often about?
Well, yeah, I think if every politician, you know, and I suppose I can stick a feather into John Howard, and even the opposition of the Labor Party right now, you know, they're arguing over they should stay and they should go out of Iraq. Well, hey, that's easy fixed. Both of you go up and join the front line and see how long before you want to stay there. And if you want to send troops into another country, you know, if these politicians want to drag it into the political arena, then you join the front rank. And I'll tell you what, there will be no more wars because politicians won't go to war. So, you know, so, I mean, and I get pretty angry about that. You know, and I have no problem with people protesting their rights and to speak out. But don't do it in a way that I feel endangers our nation and our values of our nation. To me, that is not acceptable in any shape or form.
When you came home from Vietnam, were you ready to leave Vietnam? I guess your tour of duty was complete.
I actually was, at one stage before leaving, I was actually, because I enjoyed flying so much, I actually considered applying for an extension to stay there a bit longer. But, you know, I ended up coming home. It's probably possible that I hadn't I could have been sent back later on, but I ended up changing musterings. So I didn't go back for the second tour. Though I actually applied to do a crewman's course, and due to circumstances I missed out on that, I would have definitely ended back in Vietnam. If I got posted back, I wouldn't have had a problem with that. I would have quite gladly gone back. I would have been quite happy to go back to 9 Squadron if I would have been permitted to go back there. Yeah. I have no embarrassment or shame about serving in Vietnam in any shape or form. I did nothing there that I would say that I am ashamed of or should keep secret. In circumstances, I was probably a pretty wild boy, and we did some crazy things, you know, going past the shops and throwing empty beer cans in the door and things like that, and, you know, and probably sometimes some of the locals probably had good reason to dislike us in our larrikin Aussie way. And I said, I don't think we differ from the Second World War or the First World War or any of the other soldiers of our nation. I think we all had that Australian larrikinism. It's still there.
Yeah.
And one of our other favourite tricks was if you get an officer or a new person over there, and you could always tell them, because they had, you know, they were oblivious to what was going on. You knew they were lost, and they usually had starch, clean greens on. Right? They'd be all nice and clean. And they'd have to be taken somewhere for a recce flight to familiarise themselves with the areas. Okay. And usually it was a Tuscany airfield, so we'd go over there and land. As soon as we'd see it was a newie, we'd sit him right in the middle of the seat. And we'd tell the boss, he's on board. Is he strapped in? Yeah, he's well though. So the pilot would just take off. You know, just lift it off the ground. And he'd start moving it forward. And he'd tilt it forward. And he'd be like it was like a normal aircraft. Instead of lifting off, he'd be as if he was running to take off down the, and he'd just keep running down the runway. And you'd be sitting there sort of watching the guy out the corner of your eye. And usually they got their hands, because they hadn't been on a chopper before. Probably the first time they'd been on a chopper. And they got hold of the seat, and you could see their knuckles going white. And you say, yeah, he's got a good grip of the seat. And of course the pilot would like that more. And you keep going. And be running down the runway, and at the end of the runway used to be a big barbed wire entanglement, which was probably about 7 or 8 foot high, and all with grass growing through it. And all you would see is you could see this barbed wire coming towards him, and the aircraft's not lifting off. And he's thinking, I've got to lift this up, it's got to take off in a minute. And just at the last minute, the pilot would pull it up, and he would go straight up. And all he would see is blue sky. And when the aircraft came into a stall motion, he would kick the pedal and spin the aircraft around. And for 1 minute, he's looking at clear blue sky, and then suddenly from a couple of 100 feet up, he's looking straight down at terra firma. And you could see him almost bend the bars with his hand. And the pilot would come straight back down again and run down the runway to the end of the runway, and there was a big rubber plantation. You'd skip over the rubber plantation and take off, and you could see the guy sitting there shaking. Because we thought it was a great joke. Biggest thing. And we'd pull that stunt on a regular basis. As soon as you knew they were new to the area, you'd pull that on them. So, yeah. Sometimes it happened. And we had one time, which is also brought back to me, we did an operation where we had to take these guys out a platoon, and we went to land them in a clearing, and it turns out it was more like a lagoon. And the first 3 or 4 guys jumped out, and this one guy who must have been a replacement had nice clean greens on, and like we haven't landed, our skids have gone down in the water and we still haven't touched, so we're sort of hovering, and he pulled it up again, and this guy's trying to get out of the helicopter, like how do I get out, you know, like there's water down here and I don't want to get wet. And the skipper turned across to me and he said, what is his problem? I said, I don't think he wants to get his feet wet. And he said, in that case, put your size 12 in the middle of his back and shove him out. I said, okay, boss. So I stuck my foot, size 12, right in the middle of the bloke's pack, and I pushed him. And he was like he was skydiving. He went straight out, rifle in arm, and he disappeared in the water. And of course we started to take off and he got up and he looked up. Now if he could have shot me, I'm sure he would have. I'd love to meet this guy after all these years, because what must have been going through his mind, because he was absolutely wrenched. And he looked, I reckon that he called me all the names under the sun for doing that. You know, he looked back and, what a mongrel thing to do to a guy.
What makes you proud about what you did?
Well, I wore the uniform of our country. I represented our nation. I was called to duty. And I believe I served my flag and my country with honour. You know, so, and I have nothing to be ashamed of. And I believe I was the same as the guys in the Second World War. We fought for our right as free people, our democratic right, to vote for who we want, speak for who we want, and say what we want. Though I must admit I do not accept the fact that burning our flag is a freedom of speech. That to me is unacceptable. And as far as I'm concerned, anybody who burnt the flag would go to jail as far as I'm concerned. If you're not proud of this nation and proud of its flag, then if you didn't come from this country or you were born in this country and you don't like our flag, leave it. Go somewhere else. But I'm sure when you go into some of these other countries, you'll be back very quickly. I mean, I enjoy visiting other countries, but Australia will always be home. Even though I went to Vietnam as a British citizen. And then some 10 years or 15 or 20 years later, I had to go and become a naturalised Australian, and I burst out laughing at the citizenship ceremony with the Lord Mayor. And he got very angry with me. He said, "Why are you laughing?" And I said, "Well, strangely enough," I said, "I went to Vietnam in 1967-68, and so I joined the Royal Australian Air Force in 1966. And I swore the exact allegiance you've just asked me to call for this country. And now it's to become an Australian citizen." And I said, "I fought for this country. Why shouldn't I laugh?" Because I said, "It's the same oath." "Oh, now I see your point of view." So no, it's a great nation.
What are some of the biggest risks or sacrifices that you saw from the men around you to contribute to that war?
Oh, I really couldn't answer that. I don't think there was any, I think not of anybody I knew did any great more sacrifice than others. I mean, I've heard of people who supposedly, you know, stood on landmines and things like that, and they sacrificed themselves and things like that, but I never saw any of that. And I think generally, and I hope I could say honestly in all circumstances, that every one of us would have made whatever sacrifice was required, you know, whether physically, mentally or whatever, in regards to our duty. Because it was a case, it's like when you were sick, you didn't want to report to the sick. I mean, this is where a lot of veterans have problems, in the sense when they claim for conditions, is because when you went, you didn't want to go to the medical section. The thought of being grounded or, you know, taken out of your section or whatever it was a great burden to you, because it was always in the back of the mind that if anything happened to one of the guys or one of your mates, then you were responsible, because if you had been there, maybe it wouldn't have happened. That person was a stranger to that group, so therefore he didn't know the other guys. The same with flying. It was like, well, you know, if I'd have been there because that was my rostered crew, it may not have happened. So at a last resort, you would want to report to the medical section saying you got the flu or a cold. It was only when you were in the situation forced to it that you would do it. A lot of times you would go around and see the duty medic at night time and say, "Look, I've got a cold," or "I've got this," or, you know, "I'm not feeling well." You know? And he would, 9 times out of 10, you know, highly illegal of course, he would give you the medicine you required. And you were happy, you went away. You got the medication, you got the flu, he's giving you some antibiotics, away you went. You never even thought of, you know, "Oh, I need to go to the doctor and see the doctor because I'm sick." It was more in the thought that you didn't want to go off duty. That was the last thing you wanted to do. So that's why a lot of veterans, when they claim for injuries that they've got today, have problems trying to confirm these conditions because the records, and the same as when you never went to the medical section and stood there and said, well, make sure you write all that down, doctor, because maybe in 40 years' time I'm going to be a very sick man and I need to have that support my claim against the repatriation department. It's not the repatriations department's fault that they can't recognise some conditions. It's because the serviceman did not want to report his injury, for in a sense the fear that he let his mates down or might get sent home, he was a weak link, many, many things. You hear different things when you talk to veterans. After spending 14 years as an advocate for veterans, I've heard quite a lot. And I've also heard the veterans who've tried to con me too, And one thing I never used to tell them that I was 9 Squadron Vietnam crewman gunner. I would always just say, I was Air Force. And wait till they tripped themselves up a little bit and say, did I tell you what branch of the service I was in? Because they would think, Air Force Vung Tau. What would he know? But usually when I said to them, well, I was 9 Squadron Air Crew, they suddenly got a strange look on their face, went, whoops, I better not tell any fibbies to this guy, because he obviously knows what went on. Because we used to be briefed quite regularly on operations. So I would know if any veteran was pulling a thing. Now, if I believed the veteran was right in his claim, I would fight tooth and nail for him. I once got asked by a representative of the Veteran Affairs Department why I was so dogmatic about one case that I was fighting, because I said I believe in the veterans' rights. And until you prove me wrong, I will fight. And fight I did for 4.5 years. And I used to say to veterans, don't start a fight that you're not prepared to finish. If you want to fight for your conditions to be accepted, then you must see it to the end. And if you're not prepared to do that, then I won't represent you. So,
What did you find difficult about adjusting to life back in Australia?
I suppose setting back into the mundane, for want of a better word, dull life. Here you are, you're on an, I suppose, I don't know, other veterans may describe it different, they may agree with me, but an adrenaline rush, like it was like live for today and to hell with tomorrow, because maybe, not trying to be dramatic, but maybe you're not going to be here tomorrow. So you lived for what you were doing. To suddenly come back to, well, maybe next weekend we'll do this, or maybe, so it became a mundane type life. And I came back, and of course, unaware to me, some of the problems I had for Vietnam were already starting to set in with, PTSD and anxiety and all those sort of things, unaware to me. Because I wasn't even aware until many, many years later. I was on Valium for a couple of weeks prior to coming home, which I should never have been even flying on that. But you just come back and you're suddenly on a mundane type of life, and I suddenly didn't see any direction. I became back into defence role, and with all the anti-war stuff and things like that, you got hey, what's it all for? So I think you started to think, shit, this bunch of rat bags, I would, better maybe that the communists best thing they could do is probably come and take all these people and take away and shoot a lot of them, because they've got no value in life. So I think you started to look back, and it said gradually, with the conditions and problems that started to arise, I probably got disenchanted, and then they did a medical board on me, and I was medically discharged, which also hurt, because it was my desire to serve in the armed forces. And I think another factor too, there was a lot of guys that were national servicemen or could have been national servicemen who joined the Air Force to avoid the national service. For what logical reason, I don't know. They thought, well, you know, I don't want to go in the army, they might send me to Vietnam, so I'll join the Air Force for 6 years, you know. And then after 2 years, I think, oh, geez, if I'd been a national serviceman, I'd be a civilian now. So they'd start getting disgruntled and making life a little bit unpleasant for those guys that were enjoying the military life. And of course, when I did the medical board, they medically discharged me. So, you know, then I just
Why
went
did
back out
they
to work.
medically discharge you?
I started suffering a lot of migraines and stuff like that, which, and I'd had hearing problems and a few other things. But because I'd remustered over to motor transport driver, some bureaucratic idiot, as I would say, said because I was in transport I couldn't drive military vehicles because I suffer with migraines. But they had no objection to me driving from Brisbane to Amberley every day while they did the medical board. But I wasn't allowed to drive a military vehicle on the base. So that sort of, being the person I am, thought this is ludicrous. So I started to get disenchanted, and then they did the medical board and said, well, you can't be a transport driver anymore. So I said, well, go to hell. I'll get out. But probably in hindsight, if I look back, what I should have done is remustered back to the Defence Guard, because it's gone on to be very, very strong and a very good mustering in the service. And the guys that I know that stayed in and served on all ended up WODs or warrant officers or officers. So maybe I may have ended up at that rank, but I don't regret getting out.
How did the anxiety start to play out?
I sort of became probably very quick-tempered, very, not physically or aggressive, but probably in some ways verbally aggressive, and flew off the handle pretty quickly. And obviously I wasn't aware of that, nor was my first wife, but those sort of things, that slowly started to aggravate me. And I wasn't aware of it. And the thing is, subsequently on my medical records, it was there. You know, obviously I didn't realise that until I became an advocate and in years to come. But those issues could have been dealt with quite easily in the early stages if they'd have taken the time and effort.
How did they initially deal with it?
Do a medical board and that's it. I mean, I once talked to a psychiatrist, and I don't know how true it is, I'm only going on what he is, and I'm not medically qualified to make a judgment. But he once said to me, basically, if we could have got all you Vietnam veterans the day you arrived back in Australia, none of you would have had anxiety or PTS problems. Now, whether that's true or not is irrelevant. That opportunity never came. But I guess there must be some merit to it now, because the first thing they do with all the troops is debrief them. I mean, to come back to a country, and I often talk and say that, like, they say, oh, well, the Second World War veterans didn't get any counselling. Well, that's true. They didn't. But what was unique about the Vietnam War in comparison to that was that Second World War veterans basically may have lived in Brisbane or, Toowoomba or somewhere like that. And as buddies, they joined the armed forces together. And a good chance that they trained together, they either went into infantry together, they went overseas together, whether it be Tobruk or the New Guinea, and went through the war together. And yes, they lost their mates and things like that. But they came back as a group, got a heroes type welcome, and they went back to their way of life. But where they were able to help with one another is they would meet at the local RSL or the bars. And if one of their mates was feeling a bit down or depressed, they were there to give him support and talk to him and talk him out of his problems, which is what they were able to do. This is my way of looking at it, and from the observation as an advocate when talking to a lot of these veterans. So they were able, as a community of their own right, help each other and see each other through their problems. Whereas Vietnam veterans, right, were gathered as national service and the enlisted from all over the country. They were thrown together, trained together, And if they went overseas, they went off to Vietnam. But when they came back, they said, well, thanks for your 2 years service, now bugger off. And he might go back into town and see his mate and say, oh, I haven't seen you for a couple of years, where have you been? He wasn't going to tell him he'd been in Vietnam, because if he did, you know, he could have got spat on or people would rubbish him, so he would just say, oh, did my national service, where were you? Oh, I was stationed down there. He would lie. Say, no, I didn't go to Vietnam, I was down in such and such. He wouldn't tell the truth. And then when he started getting moody and things like that, he had nobody to confide in. And if he did talk to his parents or his sister or his brother, you know, they'd condemn him or they'd tell him there's a lot of garbage and he shouldn't be a bloody sook because the Second World War guys went off for 4 years. You only went off for 12 months. But there was a big difference between both of them, you know. And that's what a lot of people don't realise. There was a big, big difference. And Vietnam veterans didn't have the inner support. Like guys that I served with in Vietnam. When we came back to Vietnam, we all went all everywhere. And they're guys that I actually trained with. And it's not till some 15, 20 years later I met up with a lot of these guys. You know, a couple of them live here right on the Gold Coast now. So, you know, whereas I said, the Second World War guys, they trained, they lived and that, you know, and they virtually spent their lifetime together to help each other. And of course now people, you know, we talk of different things. We call PTSD, anxiety, shell shock was all the same bloody thing. So, you know, fortunately, they've started to wake up. Though I think they've gone a little bit overboard. Everybody thinks now is, oh, he's stressed. You know, whether, you know, someone sticks a gun in a bank, oh, they're stressed. I'm not saying they're not stressed, but I think there's to various degrees, and I think it starts to overshadow too much.
Another thing that we've heard about the comparison between World War II and Vietnam is actually in your line of work, that they were saying because the choppers came into the war, it was a more relentless front line, that people were, you know, being turned around a lot faster. Have you thought that at all?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, the Second World War guy, like if he was in New Guinea and he was up the Kokoda Trail, I mean, he see guys being carted back that have been wounded, you know, and probably saw them guys dying on the way and realising in the back of their mind, if I get shot, this is what I've got to endure. Whereas I said, well, it really probably goes back to the Korean War, because that was the beginning of the helicopter era, where it was like a quick turnaround. You got injured, you're out. And also the fact that, like, with the Second World War guys, they marched in, like they went through the Kokoda Trail. If that war was today, they wouldn't march in, they'd be flown in. They'd be put on a helicopter and in 20 minutes they'd be sitting right at the top of Kokoda Trail. They'd chase the enemy all down the hill, and then, if need be, the helicopters will be in, pick them up, resupply them, lead supplies, medic, arms, everything will be there. So, you know, everything was in a short period of time. And as you said, you need to get troops out quickly. You can get them out, you know, and resupply them, replacements. So it's always there that support is there. So it's a different war. And I would probably say the guys in Iraq and places like that are finding it even different to us. You know, I probably couldn't even comprehend, even with the things I've seen, what perhaps their experience, and probably some of the frustrations they have. You know, I mean, I felt sorry for the guys that went to Timor, because they eventually went into Timor with their hands tied behind their back. I mean, that's what we had in Vietnam. We were actually trying to fight, and as I said to some people, okay, it's like getting in a boxing ring. You get in a boxing ring with 2 gloves on, I get in there with 1 glove on and the other hand tied behind my back. What's going to happen to me? You're going to beat the crap out of me. So I said, basically, that's what happened in Vietnam. I mean, I can reflect on one particular instance where we actually were in an enemy area, and we saw these, and they were, as far as I'm concerned, and still are today, VC walking across the field. We radioed back that we, in this area where we were, gave the grid reference and said, we have found Charlie in this area, and they physically stood in the middle of this clearing for probably 20 minutes and looked at us and knew bloody well that we couldn't open fire. And we circled waiting to get clearance to do something, to call in an artillery strike or whatever. And we actually run low on fuel. And the pilot just said, oh, we can't wait any longer. So we actually flew back to Nuidat and landed and was refuelling the aircraft when they gave us clearance to either open fire or call in an airstrike. So I feel sorry for the guys that went to Timor, whereas they were in a different set of rules. And unless they were physically shot at, then they had to question whether they could shoot back. And I feel sorry for some of the things that they would have probably have seen. So I think it lands a very large impression on your mind.
When did you think it got to the point where you needed to see someone like a psychiatrist? Did it reach a breaking point for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was getting to the point that I was becoming very aggressive. Not physically violent, but I was becoming very emotional and couldn't understand why. And after actually I got introduced to an old veteran who was his name was Tiger, and he was a Second World War guy, and he used to help veterans, and I got to sit and talk with him. And that's when he pointed out that you probably got some anxiety and stress problems. And I actually gave him my records and said, oh, no, rubbish. I'm just quick-tempered and fiery like an Irishman type thing. And anyway, he got my records, and that's when he pointed out, he said, do you realise that you were taking Valium in Vietnam? And I said, oh, rubbish, bullshit. I wouldn't take that garbage, you know. I've seen guys taking it, so no way. I wouldn't have been. And he showed me. And that's when I twigged that, hang on, I've had this problem for a long, long time, and the Air Force could have done something about this. And this was what it was. And then I subsequently found out that I was basically told that the trouble is with you Vietnam veterans, it's like a kettle, right? He said if you put a kettle on a stove and with boiling water, what will it do? It boils and it just whistles away until it becomes dry. And then he basically said, well, what if you put the lid on and then tape it down? What will happen? I said, well, it'll blow until eventually it'll explode. He said, that's right. And that's what you Vietnam veterans were. You were guys that came back, and it would vary from 10 to 15, maybe 20 years, that it was simmering away under the surface, but it was getting worse and worse until eventually, something would screw down the valve and get to the point where you would explode. And that could be in numerous things, marriage, anything, and most Vietnam veterans have been divorced. And of course their wives not understanding what it's from, and of course we're not even understanding either. So I needed to deal with it. I broke down a couple of times and said, well, I can't continue here. I need to examine it, and that's where it went. And I ended up seeing one psychiatrist who I threatened to throw out of a 2-story window. Because I reckon he needed a straitjacket, not me. And he did a report that he sent to the Veterans Department that I considered to be highly insulting to my family, to my parents. So I eventually visited him and said, well, you did a report on me that I don't believe was truthful. You said that I would have a copy of the thing and I could say whether I agree with it or not. And I said, I totally disagree with what you've said, and I don't think you addressed the issue at all. And quite frankly, I said, if you write another report on me, I will personally throw you out the window. And he said, but there is no window in this room. I said, there will be when you go through that glass pane. And he told me to get out of his office and never come back. And I told him as I left, I have under the Freedom of Information access to my file. If I find you write another report on me, I said, I will come back and I'll throw you out that window. And that was a clear indication I had a problem. So then I was referred to see another doctor, and he quite clearly realised that there was problems, and he dealt with it for about 2 years. And then I learnt to recognise some of the symptoms and the problems and what may trigger different events. So I try, where possible, to avoid situations that may get me fiery. That doesn't always work. I had occasion only 2 weeks ago that I was going to punch a bloke out in Brisbane who tended to upset me. It's probably very fortunate my daughter was with me. But generally I try and avoid that. I'm getting too old to fight. I'd rather be a lover than a fighter. I'm getting too old for that, I think. But, you know, so I learnt to cope with it. And then I became an advocate, and I think that relieved a lot of stress. When I say stress, the psychiatrist once described me as a knight in Shining armour. He said, you laid down the gun, but you picked up the sword. And that came about after that things were sorted out, because he said to me one time, when you have all these conditions accepted and your life might get some normality, what do you think you will do? I said, I don't know. He said, I do. I said, well, tell me. He said, no, I'm not going to tell you. But I will tell you in the future. And unbeknown to me, it's exactly what I did become. I became an advocate. And, you know, probably 6 or 12 months into being an advocate, he said to me, you remember a discussion we had some time ago about what you would do when everything was, your matters were all sorted out? And I said, yeah, I do remember that discussion. And I said, you wouldn't tell me the answer. He said, well, exactly what you're doing now. He said, you laid down the gun, but you picked up the sword. And you will fight the bureaucratic system as long as you have breath, won't you? And I said, I don't know, probably.
Has that been satisfying to you?
Yes. Probably selfishness in a certain degree, because I mean, a lot of veterans thank me, but I should thank them for the privilege and the honour to be able to help them and to probably deal with some of my issues and my problems. Because through them, I fought my personal war against the injustice or the government for seeking, probably it's probably the wrong way to say it, but a form of revenge against the government for not honouring us as for what we were, you know, and to say that we did not win the war and it was a war we couldn't win is an insult to our 500 odd soldiers that died. They did not die in vain and never will in my eyes, and nor will any of the Second World War ever. It doesn't matter if there's another 1,000 wars after we are gone. No soldier in any war dies aimlessly. He dies for the belief of freedom and speech. So, you know, I'm pretty strong in that. So it gave me a lot of satisfaction to fight and to beat the system. You know, to beat the bureaucratic system and say, well, you're wrong. That's why I said I don't like the words can't do and can't and it's not possible. No such word. You know, or it can't be, you know. I get so mad, I'll have somebody, I've had a bureaucratic system tell me, oh, that can't be done. Yes, it can be done. We just have to work at it and find a way to resolve the problem. And I said, in 14 years as an advocate, I very seldom lost a case. And without sort of blowing my own trumpet, I believe I was well respected by the review board for my principles and my stand. I would not fight for a veteran beyond what I believe he was justly entitled to. If a veteran believed that he should be a TPI, unless I saw evidence there to support that case, I would not fight for it. If he was entitled to 50%, I would fight desperately. If he wanted someone to fight higher, I would turn to go and find somebody else. You know, and it was never, and I don't believe anybody should consider that veterans fight for money. Every veteran, I believe, and I still share this opinion, that every veteran fights for recognition for injuries sustained in the service of his country, and therefore he should be justly treated for them. He should not have to, I wouldn't care if you're a millionaire and you served in the First World War, Second World War, or wherever. You could be a multimillionaire. If you had a leg blown off, it should be at the government's expense that you should have new legs. Nobody should turn around and say, well, he's a millionaire, he should pay for it out of his own pockets because he's wealthy. I have fought for a man that was a millionaire and had someone say that to me. Oh, look, I don't know if you know, but that bloke's a millionaire. I said, so what? His injuries are war-related. Why should he pay for that out of his pocket? The government, this nation, should pay for that. If you're asking me, should he have a service pension? No, because he doesn't qualify for it, because he has got the wealth. But his medical conditions should be the responsibility of the government, of the day. And to use them as political footballs is also wrong. No veteran, I believe, fights to have more money. He fights for the quality of life that he should have, and probably would have had if he had not served his country and sustained the injuries. I mean, you know, like us as Vietnam veterans, TPIs, we don't have access to superannuation and things like that. You know, we can't put money away for, you know, a superannuation. So those sort of things. Yes, they're well treated. But if you would ask a lot of veterans, if they did not have their service-related disabilities, they would quite ably to be in the workforce and probably have earned far more money than what they receive. And to say to a veteran, oh, all you want is money. No. He may at a certain point, yes,